A single flame quivers in the stillness of a forgotten chamber, its light trembling against ancient stone walls. The air is heavy with the scent of wax and damp parchment. At a wooden desk sits an aging scribe, his fingers stiff with cold, his breath visible in the gloom. He leans forward as a woman, frail, veiled, and dying, whispers a final confession that will never appear in any official chronicle. Her voice is barely more than a thread of sound, yet each word carries the weight of a secret powerful enough to reshape the very memory of a kingdom. She speaks of queens who ruled in shadows, of alliances forged in moonlit corridors, of bloodlines protected with the ferocity of lions. She speaks of the Merovingians. Outside, the night presses against the shuttered windows, thick with a silence that feels almost watchful. The world beyond these walls believes its history to be cleanly recorded, each king named, each succession explained. But inside this room, the truth takes a different shape. Messier. Richer, more unsettling. The woman's voice falters as she reveals the existence of a lineage guarded not by kings or warriors, but by queens whose power was both silent and immense. The scribe hesitates, quill hovering over parchment. He knows that what he is hearing contradicts everything he was ever taught. Yet he also knows, deep in his bones, that her words hold a strange kind of truth. She speaks of a time when the throne of the Franks was more than a seat of political power. It was a vessel of something sacred, something older than the kingdom itself. The Merovingian kings publicly bore the symbols of this holiness. Their uncut hair, their warrior blood, their claims of divine ancestry. But the veiled woman insists that these symbols were only half the story. The other half lived through the women beside them, queens whose names were sometimes recorded, but whose influence was almost always erased. As she talks, the scribe's candle crackles, throwing shadows that dance across her shrouded face. He cannot see her eyes, but he imagines them burning with memories too dangerous to be spoken aloud. She describes how these queens served not merely as wives or mothers, but as the living keepers of the royal bloodline. Their marriages were political weapons. Their alliances could change the fate of a kingdom. Their knowledge, ancestral, mystical, and fiercely guarded, was a power that kings relied on but rarely acknowledged. They carried secrets that would topple dynasties if revealed in the wrong moment. Her breathing grows weaker. Each pause stretches longer than the last. Yet she continues, driven by a final urgency. She tells of councils conducted behind woven tapestries, where queens negotiated with bishops, generals, and foreign envoys. She tells of messages encoded in embroidery, of oaths sworn during childbirth, of treaties solidified by handmaidens whose loyalty surpassed that of armies. She speaks of times when the fate of an entire people rested not on a battlefield, but in the whispered advice a queen gave her king in the privacy of their chamber. The scribe writes quickly now, the quill scratching like a restless insect. He feels something shifting inside him, a sense that he is capturing the remnants of a truth the world was never meant to inherit. The queen's voice dips into stories of rivalries that spiraled into war, all triggered not by kings clashing on the political stage, but by women battling over the future of the sacred bloodline. She speaks of betrayals committed not out of cruelty but out of duty, of sacrifices so severe they left scars on the soul of the dynasty itself. A draft penetrates the room, causing the candle to flicker wildly. For a moment, the flame nearly dies, and with it the fragile bridge between the queen's voice and the parchment recording her truth. She gasps softly, a sound like a thread snapping. The scribe leans closer. She is speaking now of the greatest secret of all, the origin of the Merovingian bloodline, the myth of divine conception that the kings wore like armor. But she insists that the real source of power did not stem from Merovec alone. It came from the women who preserved his lineage, who bound it with rituals and knowledge passed from mother to daughter, generation after generation. Her voice trembles when she describes the moment everything began to slip away, when jealous nobles and ambitious bishops realized that as long as the queens retained their authority, the dynasty could never truly be controlled. She recounts the slow, deliberate erasure of their power, the rewriting of laws, the destruction of documents, the quiet assassinations disguised as accidents or divine punishment. She says that the queens saw the storm coming long before the kings did. And yet, even as their influence diminished publicly, many continued their work in silence. The scribe feels the weight of history pressing down on him. He wonders if he is transcribing a confession, a warning, or a final act of rebellion. The woman speaks now of a prophecy, vague, incomplete, perhaps imagined, foretelling a time when the sacred bloodline would fall into darkness, only to rise again through the strength of a queen forgotten by all but those who knew how to look. Her words become fragile, fading like smoke. She speaks of symbols carved into stones, of messages woven into tapestries, of secrets carried across generations by women who never asked for glory. Her final breath arrives quietly, as if the truth itself has exhausted the last of her life. The scribe sits frozen, the quill still poised above the parchment. The candle's flame steadies, casting a warm glow over the final unfinished sentence she will never complete. He knows he should seal the parchment, hide it, forget it. If others discover what he has written, he may be accused of heresy or treason. But something inside him insists that this truth must survive, even if only in fragments. He dips the quill once more and finishes the queen's final sentence in trembling script. Outside, the night deepens, but inside the chamber, a strange sense of clarity settles. An awareness that he has recorded the first fragment of a story far greater than any chronicle of kings. A story of queens. A story of power that thrived in silence. A story that would one day demand to be heard again. And somewhere, in the darkness beyond the window, it feels as though history itself is holding its breath. Before the rise of kings whose names fill the annals of medieval Europe, before the carved stone thrones and jeweled crowns, there existed a strange and uncertain dawn. An age where myth blurred into memory and memory hardened into history. It is in this twilight of truth and legend that the Merovingian bloodline first emerges, not as a simple dynasty, but as a story woven from whispers, omens, and the lingering trace of something ancient. To understand the hidden power of the Merovingian queens, we must first return to the beginning, the murky birth of the bloodline itself. The early Frankish tribes lived in a world alive with spirits, beasts, and gods. Rivers were sacred. Forests held secrets. The sky above seemed to brood with unseen forces. Into this mystical landscape came tales of a chieftain whose lineage was unlike any other. His name was Merovec or Merowig, though even this is shrouded by uncertainty. Some claimed he descended from the sea. Others believed his ancestry came from a creature far older than any kingdom, something part human, part otherworldly. His birth story, told in smoky mead halls and whispered around winter fires, became the foundation of an identity the Merovingians would later guard with fierce devotion. According to the most cryptic version of the legend, Merovec's mother was attacked or embraced, interpretations vary, by a strange sea creature while swimming in the waters of the North Sea. This creature, sometimes described as a beast, sometimes as a spirit, was said to possess luminous eyes and a presence that stirred both reverence and fear. That night, she conceived a child not fully of one world or the other. When Merovec was born, so the story goes, the wise women of the tribe recognized a sign, a mark not visible to the eye, but sensed in the air around him, a destiny threaded through his bones. The Franks believed that such a child carried the blessing of both land and water, of the gods above and the mysteries below. To them, Merovec embodied the union of two realms, a walking symbol of divine favor. Later historians dismissed this tale as a primitive myth, an embellishment added by chroniclers eager to grant royal families an aura of sanctity. But those chroniclers were writing centuries after the fact. What mattered to the early Franks was not whether the story was factually accurate, but that it felt spiritually true. Legends in ancient societies were not lies, they were the vessels of meaning. Merovec grew to become a formidable leader, guiding his people through wars, alliances, and expansions that shaped the foundations of what would become medieval France. His descendants inherited not only his land and power but also the strange, shimmering myth that surrounded his conception. Even as Christianity spread across the region, the idea that the Merovingian line possessed a sacred origin persisted quietly beneath the surface, unspoken but deeply felt. Kings could be crowned by the church, but the Merovingians were believed to be chosen by something older, something beyond the reach of bishops. What is most fascinating, however, is how this divine aura influenced not just the kings but the women who joined their line. Marrying a Merovingian was not simply entering a royal family. It meant merging with a lineage believed to be semi-sacred, almost supernatural. The early queens carried the responsibility of preserving this ancient thread. Their role was not merely to bear heirs but to safeguard the continuity of a bloodline that many believed connected the dynasty to forces beyond the world of men. This belief subtly shaped the political landscape. When a Merovingian queen walked into a council chamber or stood beside her king during a treaty negotiation, she was not seen simply as a royal spouse. Her presence invoked the weight of myth. She was woven into the very destiny of the kingdom, and that gave her a unique, often quiet power. Even before the era of famous queens like Clotilde, Brunhild, or Fredegund, the earliest Merovingian women were seen as guardians of something precious, something ancient, something both feared and revered. This sacred expectation also bred danger. A bloodline believed to be divine must be protected from contamination, strengthened through alliances, or manipulated by those who wished to claim its power. While kings rode into battle to defend their lands, queens navigated the more intricate, hidden battlegrounds of marriage politics, lineage preservation, and spiritual symbolism. They could be blamed for misfortune, praised for fertility, or whispered about when omens went awry. In many ways, they were living embodiments of the dynasty's mystical identity. As Merovingian rule began to expand, chroniclers recorded the achievements of kings more eagerly than the influence of queens. Yet the legends always lingered, especially among the common folk. Old women in rural villages told stories of royal children born with strange marks, of queens who received dreams foretelling great wars, of royal mothers descended from river spirits and ancient priestesses. These tales spread quietly across generations, forming an invisible web that linked the dynasty's female lineage to ancient forces. But even myths have limits. Over time, as Christianity established deeper roots and priests asserted greater authority, the church began to view these older legends with suspicion. The story of Meroveca's conception was increasingly framed as pagan superstition. Chroniclers softened or omitted the details. Some rewrote the narrative entirely, portraying the Merovingians as noble but thoroughly human. The mystical aura surrounding the dynasty, once proudly embraced, became politically inconvenient. Yet the legend refused to die. It survived in the margins, in obscure manuscripts, folk stories, cryptic genealogies, and symbolic art. And it survived because it had power. A dynasty with divine origins could be seen as untouchable. A queen tied to such a bloodline could wield influence that defied the usual constraints of her gender and era. That power frightened many. It also inspired loyalty, devotion, and fear in equal measure. As the Merovingian kingdom grew into a vast political entity, stretching across territories that would later define Europe, their origin story became a kind of silent architecture, a foundation beneath the visible stones of history. The kings carried the visible symbols, but the queens carried the secrets. They understood the weight of the legend, the expectation of prophecy, the responsibility of continuity. They knew that behind every royal birth, every council decision, every alliance crafted in candlelit chambers, there echoed the story of a sea-born ancestor whose shadow still touched their lives. It is within this blend of myth and early medieval reality that the Merovingian queens began to rise. They were born into a dynasty where the line between the sacred and the political was thin, where ancestry could sway armies, and where a queen's influence could shape the destiny of a continent. The bloodline's origins, mysterious, contested, and shimmering with ancient symbolism, created both the opportunity and the burden that these women carried throughout their lives. And as the dynasty moved deeper into recorded history, the quiet power of their queens would start to emerge not only in legends but in actions that would shape the very structure of early medieval Europe. Long before chroniclers began carving the stories of kings into parchment, the Merovingian world already pulsed with a quieter, more intricate form of authority. One that lived behind the veil, inside the chambers where only queens, noble women, and trusted attendants gathered. It is here, tucked into the hidden corners of the palace, that the true power of the Merovingian queens begins to take shape. Their influence was not accidental. It was woven into the structure of Frankish society itself, and over time, these women became the guardians, architects, and sometimes the saviors of the dynasty's most sacred legacy. While later medieval Europe would often confine royal women to ceremonial roles, the early Frankish kingdoms were different. Their laws granted women an unusual measure of autonomy, far greater than what most royal women would ever receive again until the modern age. A Merovingian queen could inherit land. She could issue donations to the church. She could command her own household, which often operated like a miniature political court. And most importantly, she could act as regent, ruling in the name of her sons when they were too young to wield power themselves. In these moments of regency, queens stepped out of the shadows and became the beating heart of the kingdom. But even when they were not acting as regents, Merovingian queens played a crucial role in shaping politics. They were the diplomats of blood, bridges between tribes, nations, and warring factions. Marriages among the Franks were rarely romantic unions. They were strategic arrangements designed to extend influence, build alliances, or prevent wars. A queen's foreign origin often became her greatest political tool. She carried with her the customs, loyalties, and connections of another kingdom or tribe, giving her a unique voice in cross-cultural negotiations. Inside the palace, queens presided over royal households that were more than domestic spaces. They were centers of information. Servants, messengers, midwives, and advisors moved through these rooms like the threads of an enormous tapestry, weaving together everything they saw and heard. A queen who controlled her household effectively controlled a vast intelligence network. Through this network, she could learn which nobles were plotting rebellion, which bishops were hungry for influence, and which factions were rising or falling within the court. The kings might ride into battle, but the queens sensed the tremors that preceded those battles long before swords were drawn. The Merovingian legal system also gave queens a powerful advantage. Their property remained theirs. The lands they inherited from their families or received as gifts formed the economic backbone of their personal authority. When a queen granted land to a monastery or to loyal nobles, she secured loyalty through generosity. When she withheld her support, it was felt across entire regions. Some queens maintained estates that rivaled the income of dukes, giving them the resources needed to support armies, bribe rivals, or raise their children in positions of unparalleled influence. These privileges were not quiet or ceremonial. They allowed queens to become kingmakers. In the masculine culture of early medieval warfare, men shed blood for the throne, but women often decided who lived long enough to claim it. A queen's loyalty could elevate a prince. Her disfavor could condemn him. Her counsel could determine whether a kingdom sought peace or war. While kings were praised for their military victories, many of those victories were shaped by the alliances, marriages, and negotiations silently orchestrated by the queens behind them. Some queens were praised for their wisdom and piety. Others were feared for their cunning and ruthlessness. But all shared one thing: a deep understanding that their influence depended on maintaining the dignity and continuity of the sacred Merovingian bloodline. This was not merely political. It was spiritual. The early Franks believed that lineage carried divine legitimacy, and the women who produced and protected that lineage wielded a kind of sacred responsibility. They were protectors of destiny. The role of motherhood magnified their power even further. A queen who gave birth to sons became essential to the future of the kingdom. Her children carried the dynasty forward, and her position at court rose with each successful birth. But motherhood also carried risks. If she produced too many sons, factions formed around each boy, tearing the kingdom apart with rival claims. If she produced too few, her enemies whispered that the bloodline was weakening. The pressure on a queen's womb was immense. Every birth or miscarriage carried political consequences. Every pregnancy shifted the balance of influence. The queens also served as cultural mediators. Many came from foreign lands: Burgundy, Visigothic Spain, Thuringia, Lombardy. They brought with them foreign customs, languages, and religious beliefs. Their presence helped shape the identity of the Merovingian kingdom as it transitioned from paganism to Christianity. Some queens fiercely defended the old ways. Others championed the new faith. Their choices influenced everything from diplomatic alliances to the spiritual direction of the dynasty. Yet despite all this influence, the queen's power was rarely recorded directly. Chroniclers, mostly monks, often viewed female authority with suspicion. They erased, minimized, or sanitized the contributions of queens, emphasizing instead the exploits of kings and warriors. The result is a curious silence in the historical record, as if someone deliberately swept aside the traces of female influence. And yet, when we study the actions of the kings, the patterns of succession, and the shifting alliances of the era, we see unmistakable signs of a guiding hand beneath the surface. Behind nearly every major political shift in the Merovingian world stands a queen. Sometimes she is visible, her name written clearly in documents. Other times she is a shadow, influencing events through whispers, gifts, or carefully woven alliances. Their actions shaped the kingdom more than any sword, yet their stories were tucked away in margins, dismissed as unimportant by those who preferred a simpler, more masculine version of history. But the truth remains. Without these queens, the Merovingian dynasty would never have risen, endured, or achieved its aura of mystique. They were the keepers of continuity, the protectors of the sacred bloodline, the silent architects of a kingdom whose future depended on more than battles won and lands conquered. They held power in ways both subtle and profound, power that historians are only now beginning to rediscover. And as the dynasty moves into its next chapter, their influence will burst into full view through the actions of queens, whose names still echo through history. The story of Clotilde begins not with her rise to power, but with a night soaked in grief and fire, a night when her entire world was ripped apart. She was born a princess of Burgundy, descended from a royal line marked by ambition and blood. Yet before she was old enough to understand the meaning of kingship, she witnessed its darkest price. Her parents were murdered in a political purge, their bodies taken before she could mourn them, their memories smeared by the very relatives who plotted their deaths. Clotilde and her sister fled into exile, carrying with them nothing but the clothes they wore and a grief that settled like iron in their chests. Yet even as a child, Clotilde possessed a quiet strength. She learned to speak softly but think sharply, to smile with grace even when her heart trembled, to hold her secrets behind eyes that seemed older than her years. Her exile shaped her, taught her caution, patience, and the art of survival. But it also filled her with a determination that would one day redirect the course of an entire continent. When Clovis, the ambitious young king of the Franks, first heard of the exiled princess, he learned two things. She was of noble blood, and she was known for a beauty that carried an almost otherworldly dignity. But Clovis did not seek her for beauty alone. He had conquered tribes, built alliances, forged a kingdom through fire and steel. Now he needed something more. A symbol, a spiritual anchor, a partner whose lineage and character could elevate his throne. Clotilde, orphaned yet unbroken, was the perfect match. Their marriage was not a gentle romance, but it was a union of destiny. Clovis was stubborn, fiery, unpredictable, a man shaped by war. Clotilde was thoughtful, disciplined, deeply spiritual, a woman shaped by loss. She brought into his world something he had never known, a steady and unyielding moral force. Her faith, rooted in Roman Christianity, stood in stark contrast to the pagan traditions that still guided many Frankish warriors. And while Clovis respected her beliefs, he did not share them. Not yet. The turning point came with the birth of their first son. Clotilde insisted on baptizing the child in her faith, believing with absolute conviction that her God would protect him. Clovis allowed it reluctantly, but when the child soon fell ill and died, Clovis's trust shattered. He blamed her God. He blamed her decisions. For a time, their marriage trembled under the weight of grief and doubt. But Clotilde did not bend. Her faith did not waver. She insisted that the death of their son was not a punishment, but a mystery beyond human understanding. When their second son was born, she baptized him again, despite Clovis's fear. And this time the child lived. It was a small victory, but it planted a seed, one that would grow far beyond the walls of their palace. As rival tribes pressed against Frankish borders and enemies conspired in the shadows, Clovis sought answers from every direction. Strategists, warriors, priests, omens. But it was Clotilde who offered him a vision not of fear, but of transformation. She spoke to him not as a preacher but as a partner. Her words carried a weight shaped by her own painful past. She told him that power built only on the sword would eventually crumble. But a kingdom blessed with divine favor could endure for generations. Her words lingered in his mind. The decisive moment came during a brutal battle against the Alemanni. Clovis's forces were faltering. The enemy surged forward with terrifying force. Amid the chaos, Clovis remembered Clotilde's teachings. In desperation, he cried out to the Christian God, not in devotion, but in a warrior's promise. "If you grant me victory, I will believe in you." The tide turned. The Alemanni retreated. Clovis stood victorious, stunned by what felt like divine intervention. When he returned to his wife, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Your God has answered me," he said. What followed was not just a conversion, but a revolution. Clovis allowed himself to be baptized in Reims in a grand ceremony attended by thousands. The moment was more than spiritual. It was political. By embracing Christianity, Clovis aligned his kingdom with the powerful bishops of Gaul, with the fading echoes of the Roman Empire, and with the growing Christian communities across Europe. It was a decision that changed the fate of a continent, paving the way for France, for the Carolingians, for Charlemagne, and even for the shape of medieval Europe itself. But behind that decision stood Clotilde. While chroniclers praised Clovis for his bold choice, many quietly acknowledged her influence. Bishops wrote letters depicting her as a new Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great. Ordinary people began to see her not only as a queen but as a holy figure, one who had guided a king toward divine truth. And though her faith was gentle in tone, it was iron in strength. She had transformed a kingdom without lifting a sword. After Clovis's death, Clotilde withdrew from much of the political world, dedicating herself to acts of charity, patronage, and prayer. But her influence did not end. Her children and grandchildren inherited her determination, her spirit, and her fierce sense of destiny. Through them, she became one of the foundational pillars of the Merovingian legacy. Proof that queens did more than support kings. They redirected the flow of history. Yet Clotilde's story also carries a quiet ache. Despite her spiritual triumph, her later life was marked by tragedy. Her sons fought against each other in brutal civil wars. Her family became entangled in betrayals, poisonings, and conspiracies. She watched the dynasty she helped elevate become ensnared in the same violent cycles that once destroyed her parents. And yet, she never renounced her faith. She held to the belief that all suffering bore meaning, even if hidden. She spent her final years in a monastery, her prayers echoing through the stone halls like the faint memory of the girl who lost everything, the queen who transformed an empire, and the woman who carried a kingdom on the strength of her conviction. Clotilde stands at the beginning of the Merovingian queen's story not because she was gentle, but because she was unbreakable. She proved that a queen's influence could reach far beyond marriage alliances, beyond the politics of succession, beyond even the ambitions of kings. Her legacy reveals the truth the dynasty tried so hard to hide, that behind the sacred bloodline, it was often the queens who guided its destiny. She entered history like a shadow slipping under a locked door, quiet, unnoticed, and dangerous. Fredegund was not born into royalty. She was not groomed for diplomacy, prophecy, or sacred lineage. She began as a servant in the household of Queen Audavra, a low position that should have condemned her to a life of obedience and invisibility. But Fredegund possessed something far sharper than noble blood, a mind forged for survival, a will hardened by humiliation, and an instinct for power that smoldered beneath every gesture she made. In the dim corridors of the Merovingian palace, where whispers traveled faster than footsteps, Fredegund learned the rules of the game long before she ever dared to play it. She watched how secrets were traded like weapons, how alliances formed in silence, and how a single rumor could destroy a noble far more effectively than any sword. Even as a servant, she carried herself with a calm intensity that unnerved those around her. She listened more than she spoke. She observed more than she intervened. And bit by bit, unnoticed, she climbed. What drew King Chilperic's eye to her remains a matter of speculation. Some chroniclers claim he was captivated by her beauty, sharp, bright, almost predatory. Others suggest he sensed in her a ruthless intelligence that matched his own. Whatever the truth, Fredegund moved from servant to mistress, and from mistress to queen with a speed that made her enemies tremble. But her ascent came at a price. For Fredegund to rise, Adavra had to fall. The details of Adavra's downfall are murky, fogged by political bias and later propaganda. But one thing is clear. Fredegund orchestrated her removal with a precision that revealed the full extent of her ambition. Adavra was accused of violating a sacred ritual, a technical mistake that, under Frankish law, justified her exile. Many believe Fredegund maneuvered this accusation into place, guiding palace officials into a trap she engineered long before she became queen. Whether this accusation was based on truth or carefully crafted deceit hardly mattered. The outcome was the same. Adavra was cast aside, and Fredegund stepped into the role she had long coveted. Becoming queen did not soften Fredegund. It sharpened her. She now wielded resources, influence, and authority she had only dreamed of as a servant. And with them came danger. Her primary threat was not the nobles who despised her low birth, nor the church officials who feared her cunning. Her greatest enemy was another queen, Brunhild of Austrasia. Her mirror opposite in background and personality. Brunhild was noble-born, educated, politically refined, and determined to shape the destiny of her kingdom. The two women, different in every imaginable way, soon became locked in a rivalry that would ignite wars, destroy cities, and leave trails of bodies across the Frankish lands. But long before this rivalry erupted, Fredegund had already earned a reputation for her extraordinary political instincts. She mastered the machinery of court politics with the ease of someone who had studied it since childhood. She knew when to flatter, when to intimidate, and when to eliminate obstacles quietly. And eliminate them she did. Chroniclers attribute numerous assassinations to her, some proven, others steeped in rumor. Her enemies fell suddenly. Some poisoned, some stabbed, some disappearing without a trace. A bishop who opposed her influence was found dead after preaching against her. A rival noblewoman died after an illness that spread suspiciously only to those who visited Fredegund's household. Even within her own family, she wielded violence as a tool. Her stepsons, threats to her son's inheritance, met untimely ends. Many whispered that Fredegund did not simply remove her enemies. She studied them, learned their habits, and struck at the exact moment their guard fell. One of the most chilling stories tells of how she personally attempted to murder Brunhild's sister, Galswintha, the first wife of King Chilperic. Galswintha was strangled in her bedchamber, and it was widely believed Fredegund arranged the killing. Whether she gave the order with her own lips or allowed circumstances to unfold in her favor, the result was the same. Chilperic dismissed the scandal and married Fredegund almost immediately. The message to the kingdom was unmistakable. This was a queen who would tolerate no rival. Yet Fredegund was not merely a villain painted in black strokes. She was also fiercely protective of her children, especially her son, Clotar. In a world where royal succession could shift with a single death, she understood that her family's survival depended entirely on her ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast her enemies. Every alliance she forged, every assassination she ordered, every war she ignited was ultimately aimed at securing her son's future. Her intelligence also extended to the battlefield. Though she rarely appeared in open conflict, many strategic decisions during her reign bore her unmistakable influence. Commanders who underestimated her often found themselves cornered by plans whose elegance and brutality could only come from someone who understood the art of silent warfare. She used bribes, spies, honeyed promises, and calculated betrayals with equal skill. For Fredegund, war was not fought with armies, it was fought with information. Still, even the sharpest mind cannot escape tragedy. Her life was marked by constant loss. Children died young. Plague invaded the palace. Rebellions erupted. Her husband Chilperic was eventually assassinated, stabbed on a lonely road, a crime that historians still debate. Some suspected Brunhild. Others quietly blamed Fredegund, suggesting she removed even the man who elevated her once he became a liability. But Fredegund's reaction, fury, grief, and a sudden tightening of control, suggests she had not planned his death. Or if she had, she hid it flawlessly. After Chilperic's death, Fredegund became regent for her young son. Her power was now absolute. From the fortified city of Paris, she directed armies, issued decrees, and continued her bitter feud with Brunhild. Their conflict escalated into a generational war that stained the Frankish lands with blood. But while Brunhild fought through diplomacy and law, Fredegund fought with shadows and steel. Her enemies described her as a serpent, silent, cold, deadly. Her allies called her a guardian, a mother willing to scorch the earth for her child. In the end, Fredegund's life concluded not with dramatic public punishment, but with a quiet death. She died in her bed, surrounded by attendants who feared her even in her final weakness. She left behind a son who would become king and a legacy carved out of ambition, intelligence, brutality, and survival. Yet the most haunting part of Fredegund's story is not her ruthlessness. It is the sense that she carried secrets to her grave. Secrets about murders no one could prove. Secrets about alliances that shaped the kingdom. Secrets about the choices she made to protect her bloodline. Her silence in death was as terrifying as her voice in life. Fredegund was not a queen forged by noble lineage. She was a queen forged by fire, by struggle, by the relentless will to rise above the fate assigned to her. Her story reveals one of the deepest truths of the Merovingian era. Power did not always flow through the blood of kings. Sometimes it moved through the shadows cast by their queens. She arrived in the Frankish kingdom like a beam of sunlight piercing a storm, glittering, composed, and carrying with her the serene confidence of a woman trained for power since childhood. Brunhild was no shadow creeping through the palace corridors. She was born into royalty, raised in the Visigothic court of Spain, a world of scholars, diplomats, and warriors who valued intellect as much as lineage. Where Fredegund had clawed her way upward from servitude, Brunhild stepped into the Merovingian world already wearing the invisible armor of nobility, education, and political mastery. But her path would prove no less filled with danger, betrayal, and blood. As a princess of the Visigoths, Brunhild had been trained in statecraft from her earliest years. She knew how to read people, how to listen for the truth that hid beneath their words. She learned mathematics, scripture, diplomacy, and the complex protocols that guided the highest courts of Europe. She understood that power was delicate, that it required balance, foresight, and a willingness to make decisions that might wound but ultimately protect the kingdom. Her father, King Athanagild, ensured she was prepared for a destiny that would reach far beyond the borders of Spain. When the marriage proposal from the Frankish king Sigebert arrived, Brunhild accepted not only as a political duty but as an opportunity. She had heard stories of the Merovingians, wild, fierce, unpredictable rulers whose courts were filled with intrigue and danger. Yet she believed she could bring civility, order, and vision to a dynasty known for its brutal internal conflicts. She was not afraid of chaos. She intended to master it. Her arrival in Austrasia was a spectacle. Franks gathered along the roads to witness the foreign princess. Her garments embroidered with gold thread, her posture regal, her gaze sharp but calm. Chroniclers wrote that she seemed like a queen even before she was crowned. Her marriage to Sigebert was celebrated as a union that would strengthen ties between two great powers. For Sigebert, Brunhild brought legitimacy and refinement. For Brunhild, he offered a platform from which to shape the destiny of a kingdom. But if Brunhild entered the Merovingian world with grace, she soon learned that grace alone could not protect her. Her new sister-in-law, Galswintha, was murdered not long after her own marriage to Chilperic, the king of Neustria. And standing behind that murder, everyone whispered, was Fredegund. It was the spark that ignited one of the most violent rivalries in medieval history. Brunhild reacted not with rash fury, but with calculated resolve. She demanded justice for her sister's death. She urged Sigebert to confront Chilperic. And as tensions escalated between the two kingdoms, Brunhild stepped into the political arena with a skill that stunned even seasoned advisors. She became Sigebert's closest counselor, offering strategies, negotiating alliances, and strengthening his position against his brother. Under her influence, Sigebert emerged not only as a king, but as a threat to Chilperic's unstable rule. Fredegund understood the danger. Brunhild was everything she was not: noble, educated, respected, and beloved by her people. And while Fredegund wielded dark, hidden weapons, Brunhild commanded authority in the open, using diplomacy, charisma, and intelligence. Their rivalry became symbolic, two queens shaping the fate of the Frankish world through completely different paths. One ruled through fear, the other through influence. The conflict reached its peak when Sigebert gained the upper hand. With Brunhild at his side, he defeated Chilperic in several campaigns and positioned himself to claim control over Neustria. He prepared to enter Paris as a conqueror. Brunhild, by then a mother and an established political force, stood ready to reshape the kingdom. But at the height of their triumph, Fredegund struck from the shadows. She sent assassins, two men disguised as petitioners, who approached Sigebert under the pretense of offering loyalty. Hidden beneath their cloaks were poisoned daggers. Sigebert died within moments. Brunhild's world shattered. Her husband's death left her vulnerable, surrounded by enemies and trapped in a court suddenly hostile and chaotic. The supporters who once approached her with reverence now looked at her with fear, unsure whether association with her would make them Fredegund's next target. Brunhild was taken prisoner. She was dragged through enemy territory like a trophy of war, an insult not only to her person but to the entire system of royal dignity she embodied. Yet even in captivity, Brunhild refused to be broken. Fredegund wanted her humiliated, destroyed, erased. But Brunhild's mind remained sharp. She negotiated with nobles, appealed to bishops, and forged alliances from behind the walls meant to imprison her. Eventually, she married again, this time to Merovingian nobility in Austrasia, securing her return to power and re-establishing her influence. Many saw this as an act of survival. Others saw it as an act of brilliance. As regent for her young sons and later her grandsons, Brunhild governed with a firm hand. Unlike Fredegund, she did not use secrecy and assassination to achieve her goals. She reformed laws, expanded royal authority, built infrastructure, and strengthened the church's influence in her lands. She introduced administrative reforms that would eventually become the foundation of later medieval governance. She ruled not as a placeholder for a future king, but as a sovereign mind shaping policy and vision. Her enemies, however, resented her power, and they multiplied with each passing year. When her sons grew older, her influence over them became a point of tension. Some nobles accused her of overreaching. Others whispered that she was too strong, too ambitious, too unwilling to step aside. Yet her persistence was not driven by personal greed. She believed that the dynasty needed strong leadership, that she alone could protect the realm from its own internal fragmentation. But time is a merciless opponent. As she aged, Brunhild's enemies grew bolder. The worst betrayal came from within her own family. Her great-grandsons, manipulated by rival nobles and poisoned by propaganda against her, turned against the woman who had protected their inheritance their entire lives. They believed she had grown too powerful, too controlling, too dangerous. They feared that her vision for the kingdom left little room for their own authority. Finally, Brunhild was captured by the forces of Clothar II, Fredegund's son. The moment the young king looked upon the aged queen, he saw not a frail woman, but the embodiment of his mother's greatest rival. The hatred that had once existed between Fredegund and Brunhild had outlived both women, flowing into the next generation like inherited poison. Brunhild's execution remains one of the most brutal acts in Merovingian history. She was accused of countless crimes, some true, many fabricated, and condemned without a proper trial. They tied her to a wild horse and dragged her across open ground until her body could endure no more. It was not simply a killing. It was an act of symbolic vengeance, meant to erase her influence and stain her memory for centuries. But history has a long memory, and brutal deaths often echo louder than peaceful ones. Brunhild's legacy emerged not as a tyrant, as her enemies hoped, but as one of the most capable, visionary, and influential rulers of the early Middle Ages. She built roads, churches, laws, and alliances. She navigated wars with strategic brilliance. She refused to be a silent consort. She shaped the destiny of kings and kingdoms through intellect, courage, and conviction. While Fredegund ruled through daggers in the dark, Brunhild ruled through the force of a mind unmatched in her time. Their rivalry was not merely personal, it was philosophical. It represented two visions of power, two methods of survival, and two paths through the perilous labyrinth of Merovingian politics. In the end, Brunhild died violently, but she lived powerfully. Her story became a reminder that even in eras dominated by kings and warlords, a queen could push against the boundaries of her world and change it forever. For decades, two queens, one born in silk, the other forged in shadows, waged a war that would scar the Frankish kingdoms more deeply than any clash of armies. Their names, Brunhild and Fredegund, became symbols of opposing forces: order and chaos, intellect and instinct, civilization and raw survival. But the War of the Queens was never just a personal vendetta. It was a struggle for the soul of a dynasty, a conflict that stretched across generations, poisoning alliances, rupturing families, and dragging the Merovingian realm into a spiral from which it would never fully recover. It began quietly, with glances exchanged at court, whispered accusations, and the unspoken grief that united them both. Each had lost a sister, Galswintha to Fredegund's ambition, and Audavra to Fredegund's ruthlessness. Brunhild mourned her sister with dignity. Fredegund erased hers without remorse. But beneath this personal tragedy lay a deeper tension. Both women understood that to secure the future for their children, the other had to fall. They were like twin storms forming on opposite horizons, each pulling the kingdom's loyalties and fears into their orbit. As the years passed, what might have remained a private feud transformed into a war of influence. Nobles whispered of their rivalry in torchlit halls. Bishops tried to mediate, though many secretly aligned with the queen who promised them greater favors. Armies began to gather not under the banners of kings, but under the silent commands of these women. And though kings rode to battle, the heart of every conflict lay in the strategies crafted behind palace doors. Brunhild fought with laws, diplomacy, and alliances. She rebuilt cities, strengthened the authority of the crown, and sought to bring stability to a world trembling with disorder. She envisioned a Frankish realm built on justice, infrastructure, and long-term governance. Her letters to bishops and nobles were precise and persuasive, offering reason where others saw chaos. Fredegund fought with whispers. She deployed assassins disguised as loyal messengers, sent poison in jeweled boxes, and bribed generals to switch sides moments before a battle. She understood fear better than anyone, and she wielded it like a blade. She could silence a threat before the threat even knew it existed. Her influence seeped into the cracks of the kingdom like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Neither queen fought alone. Brunhild had her sons and grandsons, each crowned in turn, each guided by her sharp counsel. Fredegund had Clotar, her son, whom she molded like iron, forging him into a king who would inherit not only her throne but her thirst for vengeance. Every royal birth, marriage, and death became another move in their escalating game. The war between their factions turned fields into graveyards. Villages were burned, nobles executed, knights betrayed. Armies marched again and again across the same lands, leaving behind scorched earth and starving families who could not remember a time before the two queens ruled their destiny. Even foreign kingdoms watched with dread, knowing the Frankish realm's internal collapse could spill across borders. And yet, Despite the devastation, the rivalry held a strange, magnetic brilliance. Both women possessed an unmistakable charisma. Brunhild inspired loyalty through her formidable intellect and commitment to justice. Fredegund commanded devotion through her cunning and sheer force of will. Their followers believed in them with a fervor that outshone the weak, often ineffective Merovingian kings who supposedly ruled. As the years stretched into decades, the conflict grew colder, sharper, more personal. Brunhild sought to civilize the kingdom, and she believed that Fredegund's brutality threatened its very future. Fredegund saw Brunhild as a dangerous visionary, a woman whose influence was too vast, whose reforms undermined the old noble families, and whose strength threatened her son's path to power. Neither would yield, neither could. When Fredegund finally died, many assumed the war had ended. But her legacy lived on through Clotar II, who had inherited not just her throne but her rage. Fredegund's ghost still whispered in his ear, urging him to finish what she had begun. Brunhild, now older but no less determined, continued to guide her descendants, believing she could salvage what remained of the Merovingian world. Their second-generation war became even more brutal. Brunhild tried desperately to hold the kingdom together, to guide her great-grandsons and guard the future she had sacrificed so much to build. But Clotar had the advantage of youth, of momentum, and of the fear Fredegund had cultivated during her lifetime. He rallied nobles who resented Brunhild's authority, bishops who feared her reforms, and warriors who sought the chaotic freedom she had worked tirelessly to eliminate. The end came with tragic inevitability. Brunhild, betrayed by those she had protected, captured by those she once elevated, and condemned by the very dynasty she had helped preserve, faced a fate no queen deserved. Clotar executed her with a brutality that echoed the darkest impulses of his mother. The war was finished, the dynasty was shattered, and the Frankish kingdom, exhausted by decades of bloodshed, began to weaken from within. Yet the War of the Queens left an imprint far deeper than destruction. It revealed the true power that Merovingian queens wielded, a power strong enough to shape history, strong enough to terrify kings, strong enough to ignite wars that lasted beyond their lifetimes. Their conflict was not just personal. It was the collision of two visions for a kingdom suspended between ancient tribal violence and the hope of a more ordered future. Long after the last battlefield was abandoned, their rivalry lived on in chronicles, legends, and the trembling memories of those who survived. And as history moved forward, the War of the Queens became more than a feud. It became a symbol of female power so immense that even centuries could not fully bury it. In the quiet aftermath of the Queen's great conflict, a strange silence began to settle over the Merovingian realm. It was not the peaceful stillness that follows victory or reconciliation, but a calculated, creeping quiet, one that seemed to seep through monasteries, royal courts, and remote estates alike. It was the sound of history being erased. Records vanished. Genealogies were rewritten, and the story of the Merovingian queens began to dissolve like ink washed from parchment. Rumors whispered through the cloisters spoke of monks burning scrolls late at night, their faces lit only by the flickering glow of flames. Not all monasteries participated, only those under the influence of powerful bishops or nobles who feared the dynastic past more than they trusted it. Sometimes entire shelves of archives were reported missing, replaced with freshly copied texts that conveniently omitted certain names, certain scandals, certain connections. A chronicler might begin a genealogy with great enthusiasm, only for the record to break suddenly. Names skipped, birth dates erased, marriages forgotten. Even the clerics who copied these texts felt the weight of what they were doing. Some hesitated, quill trembling. Others obeyed without question, believing they were purifying the past by removing the fingerprints of women they deemed dangerous or unholy. The Church, rising in influence, distrusted the Merovingians' pagan origins and resented the autonomy once given to their queens. The idea that women, foreign, powerful, politically cunning, had shaped the destiny of the Frankish kingdom was deeply unsettling. And so, a quiet war against memory began. It started modestly, a document left uncopied, a chronicle selectively abbreviated. But soon the cleansing reached larger scales. Archives from earlier reigns grew thin. Records of royal marriages, especially those involving influential queens, became strangely inconsistent. A parchment describing Brunhild's political reforms mysteriously lost its final section. Letters written by Fredegund's opponents disappeared entirely. And the further scribes looked into the past, the murkier the royal genealogy became. What made this vanishing more suspicious were the gaps themselves. They appeared precisely where the queens had held the most influence. In one monastery, a scribe later confessed that he had been ordered to rewrite a chronicle, to replace Brunhild's legal achievements with vague criticisms, to remove mentions of her negotiations with foreign rulers, to insert lines portraying her as wicked or mad. When asked why, he said only that the abbot told him, "Some truths do more harm than lies." But it was not only the queen's stories that suffered. Records of the Merovingian bloodline itself grew increasingly confused. Children who once appeared in genealogies were dropped without explanation. Entire branches of the family tree seemed to vanish. Historians centuries later would look upon these inconsistencies and debate whether the dynasty naturally decayed, or whether someone had actively severed its memory. Strangely, as written records vanished, oral traditions grew louder. Old women in rural villages whispered stories their mothers had passed down. Tales of queens who ruled with wisdom unmatched by kings, who held councils under moonlight, who protected the sacred bloodline from betrayal. They spoke of symbols hidden in embroidery, genealogies memorized rather than written, and secret gatherings where noblewomen repeated the lineage aloud, so it would never be forgotten. Though these stories lacked formal credibility, they carried a fierce emotional truth, echoing through generations like a stubborn ember refusing to die. Meanwhile, bishops and nobles pushed a new narrative. They portrayed the Merovingian kings as weak, indolent, distracted, Rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. This narrative served a purpose. By diminishing the kings, they diminished the queens who supported them. A dynasty that weak would seem to deserve replacement. And, conveniently, the Carolingian family, waiting in the political shadows, rose just as the Merovingians' records were growing faint. But the monks who quietly cleansed the archives could not erase everything. Not all scribes obeyed. Not all monasteries participated. Some documents survived in dusty corners, forgotten because no one recognized their value. Some genealogies remained intact in foreign courts, preserved by ambassadors or travelers who had once exchanged them as part of diplomatic custom. A few letters written by Brunhild herself survived only because they had been stored in churches she patronized, places where destroying her memory felt sacrilegious. These surviving traces painted a different picture of the Merovingian world. One where queens wielded power not as anomalies but as essential pillars of governance. One where alliances, reforms, and crises often traced back to the decisions of royal women. One where the sacred bloodline was guarded with purpose, foresight, and sometimes ruthless determination. As the Carolingians rose to power, the disappearance of Merovingian records grew even more glaring. It was as if the dynasty had been swallowed by a sudden fog. Chroniclers of the new era wrote confidently of the past, but their narratives were built on fragments, distortions, and intentional omissions. They emphasized the chaos of Brunhild and Fredegund's rivalry while ignoring the stable decades that preceded it. They magnified scandals while burying achievements. They portrayed the queens as dangerous exceptions rather than products of a system that once empowered them. And through all this, the question lingered. Was this erasure merely the natural fading of an old dynasty, or was it the work of those who feared the queen's legacy, those who believed the sacred bloodline carried a power that must never rise again? In the shadowed corners of monasteries, in the erased margins of manuscripts, in the strangely uniform writings of post-Merovingian chroniclers, the clues point toward a deliberate suppression, a quiet conspiracy of memory, a cleansing not of sin, but of influence, not of corruption, but of truth. Because to erase the Merovingians, one had to erase their queens. He should have been forgotten. He should have died in the shadows of palace intrigue, another royal child discarded in the ruthless game of Merovingian politics. Yet Dagobert too refused to disappear. His story begins with the quiet terror of a child torn from his destiny, hidden away before he could understand the forces shaping his life. And it ends with a return so improbable, so steeped in mystery, that centuries later historians still whisper about whether he was meant to come back at all. Dagobert was the son of Sigebert III, a king who tried to restore balance to his fractured realm. As a young prince, Dagobert was watched constantly. His existence frustrated powerful noble factions who sought to control the throne through puppet kings. A legitimate heir threatened their plans. And so, when Sigebert died unexpectedly, Dagobert's enemies moved swiftly. They seized the child and smuggled him out of the kingdom, declaring that he had died of illness. No body was shown. No public mourning occurred. He vanished. But the child was not dead. Instead, whispers say he was spirited away by loyal retainers, men who believed that Dagobert carried more than the bloodline of his father. They claimed he embodied a sacred lineage that could not be allowed to die. These loyalists were helped by a network of supporters. Monks, nobles sympathetic to the old order, perhaps even remnants of Brunhild's influence still lingering in hidden corners of Francia. Together, they orchestrated a daring escape that brought Dagobert far from the danger that surrounded him. The boy was taken to Ireland, a land of monastic refuge and spiritual scholarship. Ireland in this era was a place unlike any other in Europe, a landscape of emerald fields, windswept shores, and monasteries carved into the edges of cliffs. It was a place where learning flourished while much of the continent struggled with turmoil. And for a boy raised in the tension of Merovingian politics, Ireland must have felt like an entirely different world. In the monasteries that sheltered him, Dagobert was educated not as a prisoner but as a chosen heir. Monks taught him reading, scripture, philosophy, and the art of kingship. He studied the lives of saints and rulers. He learned humility, but he also learned leadership. Some accounts claim the monks treated him with extraordinary reverence, as though they knew he would one day return to claim his place. Others suggest they guarded him not simply for political reasons, but because they believed he was destined to fulfill a prophecy, one involving the return of a lost king. As he grew, Dagobert heard rumors of his homeland. Francia was changing. Power was shifting from kings to the so-called mayors of the palace, ambitious nobles who governed in the monarch's name but wielded far greater influence. The Merovingian line was weakening, its authority eroded by manipulation and internal sabotage. The silencing of queens, the erasure of records, the rising influence of new factions. All these threads wove into a future that increasingly excluded the descendants of ancient kings. But destiny has a way of circling back. Dagobert's return began with a spark of rebellion. A group of nobles, many weary of being ruled by self-serving ministers, sought someone with legitimate royal blood to rally around. They remembered Dagobert. They believed he might still live. Their search broadened quietly, passing through courts, monasteries, and foreign kingdoms, until rumors reached Ireland. The hidden king might yet reclaim his throne. How Dagobert felt when he first heard these whispers is lost to time. But one can imagine a surge of emotions. Disbelief, hope, fear, and perhaps a spark of destiny long buried. The monks who had raised him must have understood immediately that the time for concealment had passed. A hidden king can be protected. A returning king must be revealed. Dagobert left Ireland around the year 676. His journey back to Francia would have been charged with tension. Each town he passed through held the potential to welcome him or betray him. Every noble who pledged loyalty risked angering the powerful Ebroin, the mayor of the palace who ruled Neustria with an iron fist and despised the restoration of Merovingian power. But Dagobert's presence carried an undeniable weight. People remembered the old dynasty, remembered the legends of sacred ancestry, remembered that Merovingian kings once commanded respect not through manipulation but through lineage. When he finally arrived, he was greeted by a coalition of supporters from Austrasia. They proclaimed him king, a rightful heir long denied his birthright. And for a moment, it seemed as if the Merovingian dynasty would rise again, purged of the corruption that had infected it. Dagobert's reign, however, was short and shrouded in contradiction. On one hand, he was described as just pious and dedicated to restoring order. On the other, powerful enemies suspected he had returned with a network of allies that threatened their control. His time on the throne lasted only a few years, but even in that span, he made decisions that unsettled the balance of power. He patronized monasteries, reinstated royal privileges, and signaled that the line of Merovingian still carried authority that could not be easily extinguished. This alarmed those who had benefited from the weakening of the Merovingians. And so, the end came in a forest. On December 23, 679, Dagobert was traveling through the wooded region of Wovra when assassins emerged from the trees. The attack was swift and merciless. He was struck by a spear or an arrow, depending on the account, that pierced his eye. Some say he died instantly. Others say he tried to rise before collapsing again in the cold winter leaves. His killers left him where he fell, as though they needed the forest itself to swallow the evidence. Official accounts attributed the murder to a local noble, but few believed such a man acted alone. Most suspected Ebroin or others in his circle had orchestrated the killing. Removing Dagobert removed the threat of a true Merovingian restoration. It eliminated a king who could unite factions against them. It ended the possibility that the sacred bloodline might regain its former glory. But what is most unsettling about Dagobert's death is what happened afterward. His body was taken to Stini, where a cult of veneration slowly formed around his tomb. People claimed he performed miracles. Strange lights appeared near his burial site. Pilgrims traveled to pray at his grave. Within a century, he was considered a martyr, Saint Dagobert II. The church begrudgingly recognized his sanctity, though his royal status was quietly downplayed. Why did a murdered king become a saint? Why did belief in him linger? Some say it was because his death symbolized the injustice that had plagued the Merovingians. Others say the people saw in him the last true heir of a sacred lineage, the final king connected to the mystical origins of Merovingian. Still others whisper that his death was part of a larger attempt to destroy the bloodline entirely. Dagobert should have been forgotten, but instead, he became a symbol of something suppressed yet unbroken. A king who returned from exile, only to be silenced again. A lineage that refused to die quietly. And for those who still believe the Merovingian bloodline survived in hidden branches, Dagobert II is the turning point. The moment when the dynasty's enemies realized that erasing the kings was not enough. They had to erase the memory of the queens as well. The forest of Wovra wears a quiet, ancient kind of darkness. One that settles low on the earth and clings to the roots of the trees like a memory that refuses to lift. Even now, centuries later, the place feels haunted. The branches bend as though listening, the wind moves strangely, and the ground seems to remember things it should have forgotten. It was here, beneath the bare winter sky, that King Dagobert II met a death so abrupt and violent that it still sends a chill through any who study the Merovingian past. The day began like any other royal procession. Dagobert traveled with a modest entourage, fewer guards than he should have had, trusting perhaps too much in the loyalty of the local nobles. Snow had fallen the night before, leaving the forest floor muffled and pale. The hooves of the horses sank silently into the frost. The king, wrapped in heavy furs, seemed oddly contemplative. Some later said he looked as though he sensed something. An unease in the air, a tension woven between the trees. The moment came without warning. Out of the thicket, where the frost clung thick to branches, a figure moved, silent, deliberate. The forest absorbed the sound so completely that none of the king's companions heard the assassin approach. An arrow flew, cutting through the cold air with a sound that would have been almost beautiful if not for the horror that followed. It struck Dagobert directly in the eye, a wound so precise it seemed guided by more than human skill. Some chroniclers claimed it was a spear, others a dagger hurled from the shadows, but the result was the same. The king fell instantly, the snow around him darkening with blood. The guards reacted too late. By the time they drew their weapons, the assassin had vanished deeper into the woods, swallowed by a maze of branches and fog. Some companions chased him, finding only footprints that seemed to stop abruptly, as though the murderer had disappeared into thin air. Others knelt beside the fallen king, stunned by the suddenness of the act. Dagobert's body lay twisted, his crown knocked into the snow, the wound stark and brutal against the winter landscape. Whoever ordered the killing had planned it meticulously. They chose a forest path where the king's retinue would be narrow and stretched out. They selected a moment when Dagobert was exposed, riding slightly ahead, vulnerable. They used a weapon that demanded an expert's aim. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. It was a message. Local records blamed a nobleman named Grimold. But that explanation was too convenient, too neat. It shielded the real orchestrator behind a scapegoat whose name fit the story but not the scale of the plot. The true conspiracy extended beyond a single man. Powerful factions had long wanted Dagobert dead. He threatened to reclaim Merovingian power from the mayors of the palace. He threatened to restore order to a realm increasingly controlled by nobles who hid behind weak kings. He threatened the rising influence of families who preferred kings they could manipulate. His enemies had many faces. Ebroin, the ruthless mayor of the palace in Neustria, is often cited as the mastermind. He had clashed with Dagobert's supporters, feared a return of strong Merovingian kingship, and wielded the kind of influence necessary to coordinate such a strike. Others suspect factions within the Austrasian nobility, men who had supported Dagobert's return but later feared his growing independence. Some even point to foreign rulers, who believed a restored unified Merovingian kingdom would threaten their borders. And then there are the darker theories. Some medieval writers hinted that Dagobert was targeted not purely for politics but for something more esoteric: his bloodline. They believed he carried a lineage tied to ancient rituals, to a sacred ancestry dating back to Merovec himself. If this bloodline truly held symbolic or spiritual power, then eliminating Dagobert was not just a political act, it was a sacrificial one. A way to extinguish a legacy that frightened those who understood its deeper significance. Whatever the motive, one thing is certain: Dagobert's death was intended to extinguish hope. It was meant to prevent a resurgence of Merovingian authority, to break the momentum he had begun building since his unexpected return from exile. But the assassins made one critical miscalculation. They took his life, but they did not silence his story. The king's body was carried to Stini, a lonely outpost near the borderlands. There, a small church received him. His burial was quiet, almost secretive, hardly fitting for a king. Yet something strange began to happen. People who visited the church claimed they felt an inexplicable presence. Some said the air grew warmer near his tomb, as though a hidden light pulsed beneath the stone. A soldier swore that he heard chanting when no monks were nearby. A shepherd claimed his blind sheep regained its sight after grazing near the churchyard. Word spread. Pilgrims arrived, seeking blessings from the murdered king. Dagobert became known not as a failed monarch, but as a martyr, one wrongfully slain, one whose death held meaning beyond the reach of his assassins. Within a generation, a cult grew around him. Miracles were attributed to him. His memory became untouchable. And though the church was cautious, it eventually acknowledged him as a saint, unable to ignore the growing devotion of the people. But sainthood only deepened the mystery. How did a king whose reign was brief, whose political achievements were modest, become a figure venerated with such intensity? Why did ordinary people feel drawn to him in ways rarely seen with Merovingian rulers? Why did some believe his bloodline continued through hidden descendants? The forest of Wovra never answered these questions. It kept its silence, holding the secrets of that winter morning tightly within its dark roots. But the echoes of that assassination shaped the centuries that followed. Dagobert's death was not merely the fall of a king. It was the turning point when the Merovingian dynasty began to dissolve into legend. It became the moment when history split, leaving behind unanswered questions that would continue to haunt scholars, mystics, and conspiracy theorists alike. For if Dagobert was killed because of who he was, then his death was only the beginning of a larger story, one that would pull the Merovingian queens, the sacred lineage, and the shadowy power of forgotten bloodlines ever deeper into mystery. They were not kings, yet they ruled like kings. They sat behind the throne, yet their shadows often stretched farther than the monarchs they served. In the slow unraveling of Merovingian power, the most dangerous force was not a foreign enemy or a rival dynasty. It was the rise of the mayors of the palace, men whose quiet ambition reshaped the fate of Francia long before anyone realized the kingdom was slipping from the hands of its ancient bloodline. Originally, the mayor of the palace was little more than a high-ranking household officer, a steward who managed royal estates, finances, and the daily needs of the court. But as the Merovingian kings grew younger, weaker, or increasingly controlled by factions, these stewards discovered that real authority lay not with the man who wore the crown, but with the one who controlled access to him. Over time, they transformed from servants into gatekeepers, from administrators into power brokers. Their rise was stealthy. They began by advising kings, then by making decisions in their absence. Gradually, they commanded armies, oversaw laws, negotiated treaties. By the time Dagobert II returned from exile, the mayors of the palace were already the real rulers of the Frankish kingdoms. The kings still had their long hair, their royal lineage, their ceremonial presence. But the mayors had the one thing the Merovingian dynasty had spent generations losing: control. Ebroin of Neustria was the most notorious of them all. His name became a warning, whispered with dread by nobles who feared crossing him. Ebroin did not bother hiding his ambition. He wielded cruelty with precision, crushing opposition through exile, imprisonment, and executions masked as legal judgments. His rule was sharp-edged and relentless, a reign of intimidation that kept the king under constant supervision. Some said that Ebroin treated the monarch like a prized bird, beautiful, symbolic, and completely caged. But even Ebroin was only a symptom. The real threat was the system that allowed men like him to thrive. The Merovingian kings were losing authority not because they lacked divine lineage, but because power had shifted gradually into the hands of those who claimed to act in the king's name, while undermining him at every turn. The mayors justified their rising control as necessary for stability, arguing that weak kings required stronger advisors. And the more they claimed responsibility, the more responsibility shifted. Queens felt this shift most acutely. The Merovingian queens, once kingmakers, guardians of succession, and controllers of vast estates, found themselves increasingly marginalized. Their influence, built on centuries of custom, could do little against the growing machinery of bureaucracy controlled by ambitious men. A queen could still gather allies, but the mayors could command armies. A queen could still influence her son, but the mayor could decide which advisors surrounded him. A queen could still sense threats, but the mayor could eliminate them before anyone spoke their names. Some queens fought back with everything they possessed. Brunhild resisted the rise of the mayors fiercely, using her intelligence and connections to assert control. But even she found herself entangled in a political network far broader and colder than anything she had battled before. Fredegund fought them through assassinations and manipulation, but her victories were temporary. The mayors learned from each conflict, adapting their strategies, expanding their power with every generation. Dagobert II's restoration to the throne shook this careful balance. He represented everything the mayors feared: a king with legitimate authority, with a loyal following, and with the courage to reclaim the dynasty's original power. His presence threatened their future. A strong Merovingian king meant fewer privileges for them, fewer opportunities to rule through proxies, fewer excuses to expand their influence. Dagobert's assassination was not simply the elimination of a rival. It was the culmination of a long strategy: weaken the Merovingian line, discredit its authority, and ensure that no king would ever again wield the full power of his ancestors. The mayors learned that controlling the throne was easier than claiming it outright. But as their confidence grew, so did their ambition. Merovingian kings became little more than symbolic figures, kept for tradition's sake. The real decisions happened elsewhere, in the chambers where mayors and their allies gathered, plotting the direction of the realm. By the time Dagobert II's body vanished into the saintly quiet of Stini, the Merovingian dynasty was already in its twilight. The mayors ruled openly in all but name. They met with foreign envoys. They mobilized armies without royal approval. They collected taxes under the king's seal but redirected the wealth toward their own supporters. The kings watched helplessly as their birthright dissolved into dust. Yet the strangest part of this shift was not how quickly power moved, but how quietly. The people still revered the Merovingian bloodline. Many still believed the kings possessed sacred authority. But the mayors understood something vital. the appearance of royalty mattered more than its reality. A king waving from a palace balcony was enough to satisfy public sentiment, even if he had no influence at all. And through all of this, the queens sensed the danger more clearly than anyone else. They had spent generations navigating the subtle currents of political power. They knew when the winds were shifting. They recognized when men began to look past the throne, when ambition pooled in places where tradition had once held firm. They understood that the dynasty was slipping away, and with it, the memory of everything they had fought to protect. The rise of the mayors of the palace was not just a political transformation, it was a theft of authority, of lineage, of the sacred weight that had once belonged to the Merovingian kings and queens. And as the mayors drew closer to claiming full power, one truth became clear: to erase the monarchy, they would first have to erase the bloodline. In the Merovingian world, hair was not simply hair. It was power woven into strands, a living symbol of divine authority. The kings of this ancient dynasty believed that their strength, legitimacy, and even their connection to the sacred bloodline rested in the long, uncut locks that flowed down their backs. To touch a Merovingian king's hair without permission was a violation. To cut it was an act of treason. Their hair was their crown, their shield, their inheritance from the mysterious ancestor Merovec himself. And as long as a Merovingian king wore his hair long, he was untouchable. So when the hair began to fall, cut forcibly, brutally, ceremoniously, it marked the beginning of the end. It happened slowly at first. A rival noble might shave a captured prince as punishment, a symbolic gesture that rendered him unfit to rule. A rebellious faction might cut the hair of a hostage king, stripping him of divine legitimacy. But as the dynasty weakened and the mayors of the palace grew bolder, these rituals of humiliation became weapons. The shearing of royal hair turned from punishment into policy. Imagine the scene: a young Merovingian prince, trembling in a cold stone chamber. His captors grip his shoulders, forcing him to his knees. A pair of iron scissors gleams in the torchlight. As the first lock falls, the boy's breath breaks. He knows what this means. He is no longer a king. The sacred thread that tied him to his ancestors has been severed. With each harsh slice, centuries of tradition fall around him like dead leaves. For the Merovingians, this act was more devastating than exile, imprisonment, or even death. A shorn king could not command loyalty. Warriors would not follow him. Bishops would not anoint him. The people would not acknowledge him. He became a living ghost, a hollow memory of what he once could have been. Cutting his hair was not merely political, it was spiritual annihilation. The mayors of the palace understood this better than anyone. They began to use haircutting as their preferred method of neutralizing Merovingian heirs. It was clean, efficient, and most importantly, legal under Frankish custom. A shorn Merovingian could be tucked away in a monastery, living out his days in quiet humiliation. The Carolingians, who would later replace the Merovingians entirely, perfected this strategy. They allowed kings to keep their titles and name, while stripping them of the one thing that gave their titles meaning. The people watched this transformation with unease. Stories spread through marketplaces and taverns about princes who cried out as their sacred locks were cut. Mothers told their children old legends of Merovingian hair shimmering with divine light, capable of healing wounds or bringing victory in battle. Even centuries later, these whispers persisted, a faint echo of a belief deeply rooted in the culture. At the same time, a strange pattern emerged. The more the mayors cut, shaved, and humiliated Merovingian kings, the more desperate the queens became to protect the remaining heirs. They hid children in monasteries loyal to the dynasty, disguised princes among servants, and even sent some away to foreign courts where their hair could grow untouched. Behind closed doors, queens whispered prayers, wrapped their sons' heads in cloth during sleep, and guarded their chambers like lionesses. But it was a losing war. Every time a queen protected one son, another fell. Every time hair grew long again, another pair of shears glinted. The mayors sliced through the bloodline one heir at a time. The queens fought fiercely, but the enemy had found the dynasty's weak point, a ritual that even the kings themselves believed held true power. And so, The sacred hair that once symbolized divine authority became the tool that destroyed the very dynasty it was meant to empower. As the last Merovingian kings took their place on the throne, boys too young to understand the weight of their ancestry, their hair hung long, but their power did not. They were kings in appearance only, paraded before the people as living relics. The real rulers stood behind them, scissors hidden but ready. Eventually, the time came when even the ceremonial respect faded. The mayors no longer needed to pretend. The shears were not hidden anymore. And the final symbolic cutting, the last shorn king, marked the end of the Merovingian age. Yet even now, the symbolism of their hair lingers. Historians debate it. Mystics trace it to ancient pagan rites. Genealogists wonder if the queens, understanding the hair's power, tried to preserve its meaning for future generations in ways that no chronicler dared record. For while hair could be cut, lineage could not be erased so easily. And in the twilight of the Merovingian world, the sound of shears closing became the sound of a dynasty collapsing, one lock of hair at a time. The Merovingian dynasty did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, as though an invisible hand tugged at the fabric of power while the queens struggled desperately to hold it together. In the dim corridors of royal palaces, in smoky council halls, and in the secluded chambers where alliances were whispered into being, the last great Merovingian queens waged a battle not with armies, but with time itself. They knew what was coming. They felt it like a chill beneath their skin. The age of their lineage was slipping away. After generations of internal bloodshed, assassinations, and political fractures, the dynasty stood weakened. Noble families, once loyal, now circled like vultures waiting for a final breath. The mayors of the palace, those powerful administrators who had quietly overtaken royal authority, were tightening their grip with calculated precision. The queens, who had once served as the guardians of succession and the protectors of the sacred bloodline, now found themselves fighting to keep even a semblance of influence. Yet they did not surrender. Not even as the darkness closed in around them. The final queens of the Merovingian line used every tool they possessed. Diplomacy, lineage, marriage alliances, gifts of land, sacred oaths, and the lingering aura of divine legitimacy that clung to their family. They arranged marriages for their daughters that tied noblemen to the dynasty through blood. They searched tirelessly for allies willing to defy the rising Carolingian faction. They whispered warnings to bishops, reminding them of the spiritual danger of betraying a sacred lineage. They poured wealth into monasteries that still honored the old royal bloodline, hoping to secure safe havens for their sons and grandsons. Behind locked doors, queens met with counselors who still believed in the ancient power of their hairborn, divinely touched kingship. Maps were spread across wooden tables. Messengers were dispatched under moonlight. Every decision was weighed with the knowledge that one misstep might doom not only the present king but the entire future of the dynasty. But the mayors of the palace were always one step ahead. They controlled the treasury, the armies, and the courts. They decided which nobles gained land, which bishops received royal favor, which alliances survived. Queens still possessed influence, but influence was no match for an entire political machine designed to suffocate the authority of the throne. The more the queens fought, the more the mayors tightened the net. And yet the queens did something unexpected. They adapted. Instead of trying to reclaim the old power outright, they shifted strategies. Some sought to preserve the bloodline itself, even if the throne could not be saved. They sent sons to monasteries with loyal abbots, hoping the boys might avoid the shears that symbolically destroyed the kingship. They forged bonds with families outside the Frankish realm, imagining a future where Merovingian blood might find safety beyond familiar borders. They clung to the belief that a bloodline could survive even without a crown. Others fought directly against the mayors, using the last remnants of royal prestige to rally supporters. They warned nobles that the Carolingian faction would not stop until the entire Merovingian memory was wiped clean. They pleaded with foreign rulers to support them in exchange for future alliances. They used their childhood connections, their old bridesmaids and tutors now married into powerful families, to gather information the mayors hoped to keep hidden. Still, the tide could not be turned. The kingdom was drifting toward a new era, one built not on sacred ancestry but on pragmatic political control. The mayors were preparing to transform themselves from stewards to kings, from caretakers of the realm to its masters. The queens sensed the shift as surely as they sensed the approach of winter. They saw it in the way nobles bowed, respectfully still but without true reverence. They saw it in the way priests spoke, honoring the Merovingian line, but with language that felt more ceremonial than heartfelt. They felt it in the way common people looked at their kings with nostalgia, not awe. The queens watched their sons grow up knowing that, despite their long hair and their lineage, their power was fragile, borrowed, and easily erased. They watched the mayors place shackles of ceremony upon their young kings, parading them through cities where cheering crowds did not realize the boys were little more than decorated prisoners. They watched the kingdom turn cold around them, and still they fought. One queen forged a secret alliance with southern nobles who despised the Carolingians. Another attempted to poison the rising power behind the throne, only to see her plot uncovered and her influence shattered. A third hid her child in the countryside, disguised as a servant's son, hoping to protect at least one branch of the sacred bloodline from the approaching storm. None of them succeeded completely, but none of them failed entirely. For even as the Merovingian kingdom slid toward its inevitable fall, the queens ensured that something remained: the memory, the lineage, the belief that their blood was sacred and not meant to be extinguished. They carved their names into the hearts of those who still believed in the old dynasty. They taught their daughters the history of Merovec and Clovis, passed down in secret like a smuggled treasure. They refused to let the dynasty vanish quietly. And as the mayors tightened their grip, preparing for the final usurpation, the queens whispered a promise into their children's ears. Even if the throne is taken, the blood will survive. It was this promise, more than armies, more than alliances, more than fading political power, that carried the Merovingian lineage beyond its fall and into the shadows of legend. Night had fallen over the palace like a heavy velvet shroud, muffling every sound, swallowing every flicker of light. In one of the upper chambers, away from the echoing halls and restless servants, the last Merovingian queen sat alone. She was surrounded by the remnants of a fading world, tapestries embroidered by distant ancestors, relics carried across generations, the faint scent of incense from rituals that had once sanctified the dynasty. But now, even these sacred objects felt fragile, as though they too sensed the end approaching. She was the last queen of a dying line. Not just the last in title, but the final guardian of a legacy stretching back to Merovec, the sea-born king. Her hair, once braided in the patterns of queens who had ruled through war and miracle, now hung loose around her shoulders. Her eyes, dark, sharp, and unyielding, watched the shadows shift around her. Somewhere below, soldiers marched, courtiers whispered, and the Carolingian faction tightened its grip around the kingdom. Everything she had fought for was slipping through her fingers. But she would not leave this world quietly. She had risen to queenship in a time of danger. When the dynasty was fractured, kings were controlled by ambitious nobles, and the sacred bloodline was mocked as a relic of the past. Yet she had held her place fiercely. She had stood beside her husband when others abandoned him. She had sheltered her children from assassins sent by rivals. She had bargained with bishops, outmaneuvered mayors, and held onto her influence through storms that would have destroyed lesser women. Still, no queen could withstand the shifting tide that swept the Merovingians toward their end. The Carolingians, once stewards, now would-be kings, were pushing forward with relentless certainty. The young Clotho III had died. His successors were little more than puppets. The queens who once guided kings with wisdom and strength were treated now as obstacles, relics, symbols to be replaced. And the last queen, sensing the future darkening around her, knew that her children were next. She rose from her seat, her gown whispering against the stone floor, and walked to the narrow window. Outside, the moon cast its pale glow across the palace courtyards. She could see the torches of Carolingian envoys approaching, their flames bobbing like lanterns in a graveyard. Each light was a warning. Each shadow felt like a hand reaching for her son's crown. The queen closed her eyes, remembering the day she first arrived at the palace as a young bride. She had walked through the gates with her back straight, her chin lifted, carrying in her chest the proud, ancient fire of the Merovingian line. She remembered the chants of the people, the blessings of bishops, the whispered hopes that she would bear the next king who would restore the dynasty's greatness. Those hopes had dimmed, one by one, as the political world tightened like a noose around her family. She thought of Clotilde, who converted a kingdom by sheer will, of Fredegund, who had fought like a blade in the dark, of Brunhild, who had shaped laws and kingdoms with the strength of her intellect. The last queen had grown up hearing their stories, believing she belonged to a lineage of unstoppable women. And now here she stood, guardian of a throne that no longer belonged to her family. From behind her came a soft sound, the creak of a door. She turned sharply, but it was only her most loyal attendant. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She carried news the queen already sensed. "They are coming for the king," the attendant whispered. "Tonight." A sharp, cold ache pierced the queen's chest. She felt the room tilt, but she steadied herself with a breath. This was no surprise. For months she had sensed it coming. Felt it in the way the nobles avoided her gaze, in the way the mayors spoke with increasing boldness, in the way her son's royal seal was used less often than that of the Carolingian stewards. The final blow was inevitable, but she would not meet it with silence. She moved quickly through the chamber, retrieving a small wooden box from beneath her bed. Inside it lay the last preserved symbols of Merovingian kingship, a lock of uncut royal hair from a long-dead ancestor, a pendant believed to have belonged to Queen Clotilde, a strip of cloth embroidered with runes older than Christianity itself. She touched each object with trembling fingers. "These must be preserved," she whispered, "even if the crown is lost." Her attendant nodded, tears shining in her eyes. She wrapped the objects in cloth, hiding them beneath her cloak. The queen knew that if these relics survived, the memory of the Merovingian sacred bloodline would continue, even if its political power was crushed. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Heavy, decisive, Carolingian soldiers. The queen's heart pounded, but she remained still. She had weathered too many storms to flinch now. She stepped forward, standing tall, waiting. When the door burst open, she did not look at the soldiers. She looked at her son, the young king whose fate had been taken from him before he even understood it. His eyes were wide with fear, confusion, and the dawning realization that he was witnessing the end of his dynasty. The Carolingian commander stepped forward. His voice was flat, void of ceremony. "The king is to be escorted to St. Denis," he said. "He abdicates at dawn." The queen felt the words carve into her like a blade. Abdication, forced or not, was the final act that signaled the extinction of the Merovingian throne. She reached for her son, placing a hand on his cheek, her voice trembling but resolute. "Remember who you are," she whispered. "They can take your crown, they can take your throne, but they cannot cut the blood from your veins." Her son swallowed hard, eyes shining with tears he dared not shed. The soldiers seized him, pulling him away. The queen did not move, did not scream, did not plead. She watched in silence, her face set in a mask of unbreakable grief. When the door closed behind him, she sank slowly to the floor. Not in defeat, never that, but in mourning for a lineage she had devoted her life to protect. Yet before the night ended, she whispered a vow into the darkness. A vow meant for no one but the shadows that listened. "The bloodline will not end here. You can tear the crown from our heads, but you cannot kill what the queens have kept alive." 3 days later, she disappeared from the records. No chronicler mentioned her again, but legends say she walked into the forest at dawn, carrying one final relic beneath her cloak, determined to hide it somewhere the Carolingians would never find. And from that silence was born the greatest rumor of all, that the Merovingian bloodline survived, because a queen made sure it did. Rumors have a strange way of clinging to certain bloodlines, following them like shadows that refuse to disperse. The Merovingians were no exception. Long after their crowns were taken, long after their names vanished from official histories, whispers continued to circulate through monasteries, taverns, noble courts, and hidden gatherings. Whispers that the sacred bloodline had not vanished with the last shorn king. Whispers that somewhere, far from the reach of the Carolingians, the lineage survived. The possibility seemed impossible, yet it refused to die. It began with scattered stories, told by travelers who had wandered through remote monasteries. They spoke of monks who treated certain children with unusual deference, boys whose hair was allowed to grow long even when others followed the stricter tonsure. These children carried themselves with quiet dignity. Some had features that others recognized: sharp cheekbones, a certain set of the mouth, the peculiar straightness of the spine that old descriptions had attributed to Merovingian kings. The monks said nothing. Their silence was more revealing than any confession could have been. One legend spoke of a young boy, hidden in a monastery near the foothills of the Alps. He arrived late one night, delivered by a cloaked woman who kissed his forehead and pressed a ring into the abbot's hand. A ring engraved with a symbol older than Christianity itself. "Protect him," she whispered. "He is the last." The woman vanished into the mountains, and the child grew to manhood behind monastery walls. When he came of age, he was said to have left quietly, moving south toward regions where the Carolingian reach was thin and the old families still remembered their loyalties. Another rumor placed a surviving Merovingian branch in the valleys of Burgundy, protected by nobles who despised the Carolingians' rise to power. They hid these supposed descendants among their own children, raising them as part of their household, training them in the arts of leadership and war. According to this tale, when Carolingian emissaries came searching, the nobles lied without hesitation, weaving false genealogies that concealed the truth. In southern France, particularly around the region of Septimania, whispers grew louder still. This land, with its blend of Roman, Visigothic, and Jewish communities, was famous for harboring those displaced by political upheaval. It was here that some believed Merovingian descendants found refuge. A few chroniclers hinted that they integrated into local noble families, preserving their lineage through marriages that left no obvious trace. Others claimed that entire villages kept secret genealogies, memorized rather than written, ensuring the bloodline would endure even if all documents were destroyed. One of the most enduring legends centered around Dagobert II. Though his assassination was meant to extinguish any possibility of restoration, his cult of sainthood complicated matters. The veneration at Stini grew so fervent that some believed his lineage became part of a sacred promise, that his descendants would return in a time of crisis, fulfilling an ancient prophecy. As the centuries progressed, pilgrims whispered stories of visions, dreams, and signs that Dagobert's blood still flowed somewhere in the shadows. One medieval manuscript, its origins uncertain, its authorship debated, contained a cryptic line: "The branch is cut, but the root sleeps." Scholars interpreted this as a metaphor. Mystics interpreted it literally. It was this idea, a sleeping root, that fueled countless theories, some grounded in faint historical evidence, others drifting into the realm of the esoteric. The belief that the Merovingian bloodline survived was not simply about lineage. It was about identity, myth, and the enduring power of a story that refused to be erased. The Church's role in this mystery was equally complicated. Officially, the Church supported the Carolingians, but scattered accounts indicate that certain abbots and bishops, particularly in remote regions, quietly preserved Merovingian memories. Some protected genealogical scrolls that should have been destroyed. Others baptized children in secret, giving them names associated with the old dynasty. A few chroniclers even suggested that clergymen believed the Merovingians held a unique spiritual significance, one tied to a mixture of pagan ancestry and early Christian sanctity. In some circles, the notion of a hidden king became more than a whisper. It became a hope that one day a descendant might rise, reclaiming Francia from corruption and restoring a kingdom once believed to have divine origins. This hope was never realized in political terms, but it persisted in the hearts of those who distrusted the Carolingian order. As time passed, these stories evolved. Secret societies, some real, many imagined, were said to guard the lineage. Families claimed descent from Dagobert, from Clovis, from the queens who once shaped Europe. Medieval poets wrote coded verses hinting that the bloodline lived on. Troubadours wove songs of a sleeping king who would return in an age of darkness. Pilgrims carried symbols carved with Merovingian motifs, believing them to hold protective power. And in the centuries that followed, the rumors merged with new mythologies. Some connected the Merovingians to the legend of the Grail kings. Others claimed the bloodline passed into houses that would later become significant in European politics. A few even suggested that the queens, who had always been the true anchor of the lineage, had hidden descendants through daughters, whose names were lost but whose blood endured. Historians scoffed, but the stories persisted. Why? Because something about the Merovingian fall felt unnatural, too orchestrated, too clean, too convenient. The disappearance of records, the destruction of genealogies, the imprisonment and cutting of royal children. All of it hinted at a ruthless, calculated effort to erase not just a dynasty, but an identity. And when history erases that deeply, the human mind fills in the gaps with possibilities. Did the bloodline survive? Perhaps. The evidence is largely circumstantial, scattered, distorted by centuries. But the persistence of the rumor is remarkable. Crosses borders, languages, centuries. It appears in church writings, folk tales, aristocratic claims, and mysterious manuscripts that surface without explanation. More importantly, the rumor speaks to a deeper truth, that the Merovingian story was too powerful to be extinguished by politics alone. Their queens, their myths, their symbols, their sacred ancestry. All of it was woven so deeply into the cultural imagination that even their downfall could not sever it. If the bloodline did survive, it survived because people believed in it. If it did not survive biologically, it survived symbolically through the echoes left in Europe's collective memory. Either way, the rumor became part of the dynasty's afterlife. A shadow lineage wandering through centuries, refusing to die, refusing to fade, and forever tempting historians with the most tantalizing question of all. What if the sacred bloodline never truly disappeared? Long after the last Merovingian king was shorn and dethroned, long after the royal palaces fell silent and the queens faded into the margins of chronicles, a strange prophecy began to echo across medieval Europe. It did not come from official church teachings or royal proclamations. It came instead from monks in remote monasteries, from wandering hermits, from pilgrims who claimed to have heard whispers in dreams. It spoke of a king, a priest-king, who would rise when the world was drowning in corruption. A ruler descended from a sacred bloodline, a child of an ancient lineage that refused to die. Many believed the prophecy pointed to the Merovingians. The legend took root in the 9th century, a time when Europe was plagued by invasions, famine, and political chaos. People longed for a savior, someone who could restore order and purity. And in that longing, they looked backward, to the memory of kings who were said to rule not because of political manipulation but because of divine right. Kings whose hair symbolized holiness. Kings whose queens were guardians of mystical wisdom. The prophecy described a figure known as the last world emperor or the hidden king. He would be born from a bloodline preserved in secret, raised in obscurity, and revealed only when the world needed him most. He would unite Christian lands, defeat enemies of the faith, and usher in an age of peace before withdrawing to Jerusalem. There, he would lay down his crown at the Mount of Olives, signaling the beginning of the final days. But in some versions, those whispered quietly in the corners of monasteries, the prophecy was more specific. It did not speak merely of a king. It spoke of a Merovingian king, and more intriguingly, it spoke of the queens who would preserve his lineage. The notion that such a prophecy could be linked to the Merovingians was not entirely far-fetched. Medieval people believed that holy bloodlines did not simply vanish. They could be hidden, protected, disguised. The sudden disappearance of Merovingian heirs, the mysterious gaps in their genealogies, and the suspicious destruction of records only fueled speculation. If a bloodline had been targeted for extinction, then surely someone, somewhere, had saved it. This idea aligned perfectly with the prophecy. In the margins of certain manuscripts, scribes doodled symbols associated with Merovingian royalty, fleur-de-lis patterns combined with ancient runes, strange sigils that blended Christian and pagan iconography. Scholars later dismissed these as artistic embellishments. but to medieval readers they were signs, clues, proof that the Merovingian story was not finished. The queens, too, played a central role in the prophecy's evolution. While kings were often remembered for wars and reigns, queens were remembered for continuity. They brought children into the world. They preserved traditions. They passed down private rituals and ancestral knowledge. Many believed that if a sacred bloodline survived, it survived through the women who carried it in secret. One tale tells of a queen, unnamed in the surviving fragments, who fled into the mountains with her child during the Carolingian usurpation. She was said to have sought refuge in a monastery known for its strict silence. There, under the protection of monks who revered the old lineage, she raised her son hidden from the eyes of the world. This son, the story claimed, was destined to become the priest-king of prophecy. Another account, written by a monk in the 10th century, described a vision in which a woman, crowned in stars, descended from heaven, carrying a child wrapped in a cloak embroidered with long golden hair. The monk believed this woman symbolized the Merovingian queens, and the child represented the hidden heir who would one day restore the kingdom. These visions were not mainstream theology, but they circulated widely in mystical circles. Pilgrims repeated them around campfires. Hermits recited them as warnings. Nobles invoked them to justify rebellions. Even kings, those who feared the possibility of a rightful heir emerging from the shadows, kept an uneasy eye on such rumors. The prophecy grew more detailed as centuries passed. Some versions claimed the hidden king would be born in a place where 3 rivers met. Others insisted he would be raised by monks who spoke the language of the old world. Still others asserted that his existence would be known only to a select group of guardians, descendants of the queen's loyal attendants who had carried the bloodline across dangerous generations. But what made the prophecy especially powerful was its emotional core. It offered hope. In a world ravaged by war, disease, famine, and political tyranny, people clung to the belief that a lost king could return. They imagined a time when justice would no longer be bought by nobles, when the church would be purified of corruption, when power would belong to the rightful heir of a sacred dynasty. And beneath that longing was an even deeper belief that the Merovingians were not merely kings, they were symbols of divine order. Their fall was seen not as a natural political shift but as a rupture in the cosmic balance. A wrong that destiny itself would someday correct. This was why the prophecy endured. Even when the Carolingians solidified their rule, even when Charlemagne's name overshadowed all kings before him, even when the Merovingians were reduced to footnotes, the story of the hidden king survived. It survived because a hidden lineage represented more than politics. It represented righteousness, hope, restoration, and the belief that history could still be set right. By the High Middle Ages, the prophecy had taken on a life of its own. Secret orders, mystic brotherhoods, and obscure sects quietly adopted elements of the legend. They studied genealogies. They followed clues. They whispered that certain noble houses carried the old blood. They claimed that sacred symbols carved into stone churches pointed to the locations where the lineage was hidden. And at the center of all these theories lay one haunting question. If the Merovingian bloodline still existed, then who guarded it? Some looked to the queens, those forgotten figures of power and resilience. Others sought hidden monastic orders. A few believed the guardians operated in plain sight, disguised as loyal servants to new dynasties while secretly preserving the memory of the old. The prophecy of the priest-king was more than a myth. It was a reminder, a warning, a promise whispered through centuries, that the sacred bloodline had not been extinguished, only hidden. Long before secret societies became the fascination of conspiracy theorists and novelists, long before the Templars or Rosicrucians etched their symbols onto the imagination of Europe, there existed smaller, quieter groups. They had no banners, no formal oaths, no grand ceremonies carved into stone. Instead, they operated through whispered vows, coded gestures, and networks of loyalty that stretched across kingdoms. These were the hidden guardians, men and women who moved in the folds of history, sworn to protect something fragile, something dangerous, something sacred, the surviving bloodline of the Merovingian queens. No one is entirely sure when these guardians first emerged. Some say they began during the reign of Brunhild, when her enemies circled her court like wolves and she needed eyes in every corridor, ears in every council hall. Others place their origin in the chaotic years after Dagobert II's murder, when loyalists feared that the dynasty's remnants would be hunted to extinction. A few even insist that the hidden guardians trace their lineage directly to the early pagan priestesses and wise women who surrounded Merovec himself. Whatever their beginnings, one truth becomes clear. These guardians were not born from conspiracy. They were born from necessity. The Merovingian queens, more than anyone, understood the peril facing their lineage. They had seen sons murdered, hair shorn, heirs vanished into monasteries that served their enemies instead of their family. They knew no law could protect them, no treaty could guarantee safety, no bishop could be trusted without question. So they turned to those who could move unnoticed. Handmaidens, tutors, scribes, minor nobles, nuns, monks, people whose social positions allowed them to slip between the cracks of the political world like smoke. These guardians rarely acted openly. Their strength lay in secrecy. One might intercept a message meant for a Carolingian ally. Another might smuggle a royal infant out of the palace minutes before soldiers arrived. A monk might falsify a record, altering a birth date or concealing a name. A noblewoman might hide a Merovingian descendant by claiming the child as her own. Each guardian acted independently, yet somehow their actions formed a tapestry of protection woven across decades. One story, preserved in a monastery chronicle before being struck out with a violent slash of ink, tells of a midwife who served 3 generations of queens. When the Carolingian faction demanded the surrender of a newborn prince for religious care, she sensed danger. Under cover of night, she switched the infant with the child of a noblewoman who had died during childbirth that same morning. The dead woman's family mourned a king's son they believed was theirs, while the true Merovingian heir was carried into the hills disguised as a peasant boy. The midwife vanished the next day. Some believed she joined a convent. Others claimed she was killed, but the child survived. Another tale, found in the margins of a damaged manuscript, describes a group of monks in Austrasia who, upon learning that Carolingian envoys were coming to seize a Merovingian youth studying in their abbey, hid him beneath the floor of the chapel for 2 nights. They taught him a coded prayer that would be recognized by other hidden guardians. They then shaved another boy's head, presenting him as the prince in question. The Carolingians took the decoy. The real heir escaped with the monk's secret blessing. These acts were dangerous. They could cost the guardians their lives. And many did die. Some were burned as heretics, others executed for treason, others simply disappeared. But the network persisted, fueled by something stronger than fear, loyalty to a lineage believed to be sacred. Over time, these scattered guardians gained subtle organization. Not formal but organic. Families passed down their vows in secret. Monasteries protected records that contradicted the official histories. Certain noble houses quietly tracked genealogies no one else was supposed to know. They communicated through symbols carved into chapel walls, 3 interlocking spirals, or a lily pierced by a thread-like line representing royal hair. The Carolingians, for their part, tried to stamp out these networks. They replaced abbots, burned archives, and executed nobles accused of clinging to the old kings. But the more they tried to erase the past, the more the guardians adapted. They became harder to identify, harder to predict, impossible to uproot. As the Middle Ages progressed, the guardians' methods evolved. In some regions, they aligned themselves with emerging monastic orders, using religious legitimacy as a shield. In others, they blended into merchant guilds, using trade routes to communicate across vast distances. A few aligned with knights returning from the early Crusades, leveraging the chaos of continental politics to protect what they believed was the bloodline's last hope. By the 12th century, European politics had become a labyrinth. Kingdoms rose and fell, crusades raged, and dynasties fractured. In this chaos, rumors of a hidden Merovingian descendant gained new traction. Some claimed the guardians knew exactly where the heir lived, protected in a mountain valley, or hidden among the aristocracy of southern France, or living a monk's quiet life in an abbey with no name. Others believed the guardians themselves were uncertain, following threads of genealogy that may or may not lead to the truth. But the guardians continued their work, not because they sought to restore a king, but because they believed the bloodlines symbolized something the world desperately needed: a connection to a time when queens fought for wisdom, justice, and continuity. A lineage that blended pagan ancestry with Christian sanctity. A dynasty that, even in its darkest moments, carried a sense of destiny. Some guardians began to interpret their mission less literally and more symbolically. Protecting the bloodline meant protecting its memory, its story, its essence. They preserved manuscripts others tried to destroy. They guarded relics of royal queens. They ensured that the legends of Clotilde's baptismal miracle, of Brunhild's reforming intellect, of Fredegund's fierce survival, were not lost. Centuries later, when secret societies and esoteric orders began to form across Europe, many absorbed fragments of guardian lore. Some adopted Merovingian symbols. Others whispered of hidden heirs without fully understanding the origins of the tales. The original guardians, long gone, became inspirations rather than active protectors, ghosts guiding the evolution of myth. Yet one question remained, floating like a pale thread through history. Were these guardians merely preserving stories, or were they still protecting something real? Some historians dismiss the entire idea as fantasy, but others, examining the scattered evidence, cannot shake the feeling that beneath the layers of myth lies a truth that refuses to die, a bloodline that refused to die, a network that refused to break, and a memory that refused to fade. Because guarding a legacy is not only about protecting people. It is about protecting possibility. Across the landscapes of medieval Europe, stone spoke when written words were silenced. Walls, columns, chapels, sarcophagi, each carried messages that could not be openly recorded. And when the chronicles of the Merovingians were being erased, when monks quietly removed their names and officials rewrote their histories, the truth found sanctuary in stone. Symbols, carved with deliberate subtlety, became the silent witnesses of a legacy that refused to vanish. For centuries, historians believed these carvings were mere artistic flourishes, patterns, decorations, motifs common to early medieval art. But the deeper one looks, the more these symbols begin to form a hidden language. A language left by those who remembered the queens, the kings, the bloodline. A language crafted by architects, stonemasons, and monks who understood that stone endures where ink can be burned. In small rural churches, far from the political centers of power, certain recurring motifs appear again and again. Coiling serpents intertwined with lilies, suns flanked by crescent moons, strange spirals with 7 spokes, and most curious of all, the long-haired figure carved in a posture of blessing or kingship. These carvings appear in places where no Merovingian king was known to have ruled, and yet carry features unmistakably linked to the dynasty. Narrowed eyes, flowing hair, elongated hands. Some are placed in corners where only the attentive would notice them. Others are hidden beneath layers of plaster, uncovered centuries later by accident. The spirals, in particular, have puzzled scholars. They appear carved onto lintels, baptismal fonts, and even grave markers. Some spirals are single, others triple, others arranged into a pattern that resembles the ancient sunwheel, a symbol predating Christianity by millennia. But in Merovingian contexts, the spiral often accompanies another symbol, a small, thin-lined arc crossing the bottom, like a strand of hair. To those who understand the dynasty's traditions, the meaning is unmistakable. Hair was power. Hair was lineage. Hair was the mark of divine sovereignty. A spiral crossed with a strand of hair hints at the eternal nature of the bloodline. Coiling, looping, continuing without end. Even more intriguing are the carvings found in the Meuse and Moselle regions, lands once central to Merovingian rule. Here, stonemasons carved a peculiar fish-like creature with a human face, swimming through waves beneath royal insignia. Official interpretations claim this is merely a crude representation of Christ as the fisher of men. But the creature bears no resemblance to the ichthys symbol used in Christian art. Instead, it resembles the legendary Quinator, the mythical sea beast said to have fathered Merovingian, the dynasty's founder. Why would such a pagan, pre-Christian symbol appear in churches constructed centuries after the Merovingians fell? Why would masons risk carving a creature tied to a lineage the church had all but erased? Unless someone wanted the symbol to endure. In the cathedrals built during the Carolingian and early Capetian eras, long after the Merovingians had vanished from power, there are anomalies that perplex even modern architects. At the bases of pillars, under the feet of saints, hidden in the tracery of stained glass, appear symbols that do not match the aesthetic or theological themes of the era. A fleur-de-lis twisted into a serpent, a queen's hand holding a strand of hair, a geometric pattern that, when traced, forms the shape of a Merovingian crown, oval, not pointed, simple rather than ornate. Sometimes these symbols are placed in locations so subtle that only someone searching for them would find them. Behind a choir stall, under an altar cloth, carved into the underside of a stone bench. These hidden placements suggest intentional secrecy. They were meant for a specific audience, those who knew the old stories, those who remembered the queens, those who believed the bloodline still held meaning. One of the most enigmatic carvings appears in a small chapel in eastern France. At first glance, it seems to depict a typical nativity scene. But look closely at the manger, and one sees a peculiar symbol etched beneath the child figure. A three-pointed crown above a strand of wavy lines. Scholars have argued endlessly over its meaning. Some suggest it references the Trinity. Others claim it is a Mason's signature. But those familiar with Merovingian iconography recognize the pattern immediately. It is the symbol used for the anointing of royal hair, the ancient rite that declared the kings sacred. Why place this symbol beneath a depiction of the Christ child? Why equate the birth of Jesus with the birth of a Merovingian king? Unless, perhaps, the carver belonged to a hidden tradition that saw the Merovingians not just as rulers, but as divinely linked. Another mystery lies in the Abbey of St. Florent, where a series of capitals depict scenes from the Old Testament. The story of Samuel choosing David, the anointing by oil, the crowning of a young king. But in one corner, largely unnoticed, a queen stands behind Samuel, holding a strand of hair in her hand. This detail appears nowhere in biblical scripture. It appears nowhere else in medieval art. It is unique, and it hints at something profound, that the carver saw queens, not prophets, as the true carriers of divine authority. It is a hidden tribute to the Merovingian queens who safeguarded the sacred lineage. The most haunting symbol, however, appears not on a cathedral wall, but on a stone sarcophagus discovered near an old Merovingian burial ground. The lid is carved with a motif found nowhere else in Europe. A long-haired woman standing with arms open, encircled by spirals and stars, her crown shaped like two crescent moons crossing at the base. Scholars cannot decipher it. Some say she is a representation of the Virgin Mary. Others believe she is a lost goddess of the Frankish tribes. But to those who study Merovingian queens, the figure bears an uncanny resemblance to the earliest depictions of Clotilde and Brunhild, those few that escaped destruction. The crescents beneath her crown resemble hair. The spirals surrounding her evoke eternity. She stands alone, a guardian in stone, a silent testament to the power once held by the queens. Who carved her? Who hid her? Who ensured she would survive when written histories did not? Stone endures, symbols endure, and through them, the memory of the sacred bloodline endures. The question is no longer whether the Merovingians left behind clues. The question is why and for whom they left them. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance and early modern eras, the Merovingians had been gone for nearly a millennium. Their records were fragmented, their lineage questioned, their legacy tangled in rumor and myth. Yet it was precisely in this age of rediscovery, when scholars dug through old libraries, when antiquarians hunted manuscripts, when kings commissioned vast genealogies, that the Merovingians rose again not as rulers, but as questions that refused to be answered. It began innocently. A monk cataloging dusty scrolls in a remote abbey stumbled across a peculiar manuscript, half genealogy, half prophecy, that preserved names the Carolingians had supposedly erased. He carried the document to his abbot with trembling hands. By morning, the manuscript had vanished. The monk was told he had misread it, imagined it, mistaken one genealogy for another. Yet he never forgot the names written in elegant Merovingian script. Names he had never seen before, names that should not have existed. In universities across Europe, scholars of the 16th and 17th centuries began noticing inconsistencies in the early medieval chronicles. Family trees ended abruptly. Successions appeared illogical. Kings appeared in one document only to vanish completely in another. But the most troubling discovery was how consistent these gaps were. Nearly all centered on the Merovingian queens and the descendants connected to them. One Italian scholar, a fiercely intelligent historian named Matteo d'Arezzo, spent decades examining early Frankish records. He published a treatise arguing that the Merovingian erasure was deliberate, that political forces had manipulated history to justify later dynasties. His work caused a scandal. Bishops condemned the manuscript. Nobles mocked it. The university revoked his teaching license. Months later, he died suddenly in what was declared a fever, though some whispered that he had been poisoned. His treatise disappeared from circulation, surviving only in a single damaged copy hidden in a private collection. Other scholars met similar fates. A French antiquarian, Étienne Leclerc, produced a bold genealogical map connecting several noble houses to unrecorded Merovingian branches. His work was dismissed as dangerously speculative, and he was forced to publicly retract his findings. Days later, his home burned mysteriously to the ground. Most of his research turned to ash. Only a handful of pages survived, discovered centuries later between the pages of an unrelated book. In Germany, a learned monk named Friedrich of Hildesheim discovered an archive of early medieval letters referencing a queen in exile who carried her lineage into the mountains during the Carolingian takeover. He attempted to publish his findings. Before he could, he was transferred to a distant monastery and placed under strict silence. His letters requesting assistance vanished. His manuscript was never found. Over and over, those who reached too deeply into Merovingian history met ruin, mockery, censorship, exile, or death. Again and again, documents disappeared. Collections were mysteriously misplaced. Libraries suffered fires. Families who claimed Merovingian ancestry were pressured to abandon their lineage or reshape their genealogies. Was this coincidence? Or the lingering echo of an ancient fear? As the Enlightenment dawned, scholars grew bolder. Reason demanded investigation. Curiosity demanded answers. The Merovingians, once relegated to footnotes, became subjects of intense debate. Yet the deeper researchers dug, the stranger the patterns became. Some manuscripts seemed intentionally altered. Names scratched out with a blade, dates overwritten, margins blackened with ink. Others contradicted each other in ways that felt suspiciously deliberate. In a few cases, entire sections of important chronicles were torn away, leaving behind ragged edges as if someone centuries earlier had panicked and ripped out the truth. One scholar, the brilliant but eccentric Antoine Montrevel, believed he discovered a hidden code in several medieval manuscripts, a series of symbols marking passages that once referenced the queens. He claimed these markings mapped a trail of erased history, leading to a secret that had been suppressed for generations. Montrevel attempted to present his findings to the Royal Academy of Sciences. They laughed. He was expelled from the hall. Within a week, he disappeared. His home was found empty, his notes missing, his research lost. Even more chilling were the patterns emerging in church records. Some genealogies connected to saints, bishops, and noble families had unexplained additions. Orphans adopted suddenly, unknown women marrying into powerful houses, children appearing without clear parentage. Later historians suspected these additions hid Merovingian blood behind new names. But the greatest mystery came from the scholars who confessed their doubts privately. Letters uncovered in the 19th century revealed hidden correspondences between historians, theologians, and archivists who admitted, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes fearfully, that something was wrong with early Frankish history. They sensed the shape of an absence, a void where a story should have been. They admitted that the queens, in particular, were too important to have left so few traces. They felt, in their bones, that truths had been stolen from the past. and yet none dared publish these doubts openly. Some feared the church would condemn their work. Others feared powerful families whose authority rested on the Carolingian or Capetian succession. A few simply felt overwhelmed by the labyrinth of missing pieces, unwilling to risk their reputations on conclusions they could not fully prove. But the pattern remained. Again and again, those who sought the Merovingians too deeply were silenced by ridicule, by pressure, or by fate. What was it about this dynasty that made the guardians of history so uneasy? What truth, hidden in burned manuscripts and forbidden genealogies, was dangerous enough to destroy careers? As the centuries passed, the puzzle only grew more compelling. Historians gathered fragments. Mystics spun legends. Secret societies adopted symbols linked faintly to the old queens. Novelists and poets sensed the irresistible mystery and began weaving it into stories of lost heirs and sacred bloodlines. But beneath all the speculation, one haunting truth remained. The Merovingians left behind questions that no historian could answer without stepping into the realm of the forbidden. And all who dared to ask those questions too loudly learned the same lesson. Some history does not like to be uncovered. By the time Europe entered the age of revolutions and empires, the Merovingians had become more than a forgotten dynasty. They had become an unanswered question. Their story lingered in the margins of chronicles, in the cracks of cathedrals, in the superstitions of rural villages. Scholars fought over them. Genealogists argued about them. But it was in the shadows, far from official history, that their legacy truly came alive again. For in that age of secret societies, underground brotherhoods, and whispered rituals, the Merovingian queens and their sacred bloodline were reborn not as historical figures, but as symbols of a hidden truth that many believed had been suppressed for over 1,000 years. It began with a single document. In the late 18th century, an antiquarian in southern France claimed to have discovered a manuscript in a dusty monastic library, an illuminated text containing strange genealogies, references to forgotten queens, and a symbol resembling a long lock of hair entwined with a fleur-de-lis. He believed it proved the continuation of the Merovingian bloodline through obscure noble families. He shared it with a small circle of intellectuals. Within weeks, the manuscript vanished, but its disappearance only fueled curiosity. Soon after, rumors began spreading about a society of scholars calling themselves custodes sanguinis, the keepers of the blood. According to legend, they met at night in abandoned chapels or candlelit cellars. Their purpose was not political rebellion but historical restoration. They sought the truth about the Merovingian queens and the hidden branches of their lineage. Some said their members included monks, aristocrats, even a few royal advisors who believed the French monarchy's legitimacy rested not with the Bourbons but with blood far older. No proof of their existence survives. Perhaps none ever existed. But the rumors alone were powerful enough to birth imitators. In the early 19th century, France was a land obsessed with mystery. Gothic novels flourished. Occult circles met in hidden salons. Artists sought inspiration in medieval ruins. Historians dug through the rubble of the past with newfound zeal. Into this cultural fervor stepped the Merovingians, the perfect blend of forgotten royalty and forbidden legend. It was around this time that stories of the Priory of Chaon began to circulate in secretive whispers. Though modern scholarship dismisses these claims as later fabrications, the idea itself had roots in earlier societies. A brotherhood sworn to protect a sacred bloodline linked to the early kings of the Franks, especially those born of the mystic lineage of Merovingian. Whether real or imagined, such whispers spread like wildfire. They blended fact with fantasy. A monastery in the Vosges Mountains supposedly preserved a relic of Brunhild, a gold-threaded veil embroidered with symbols no one could decipher. A hidden vault beneath a ruined chapel was said to contain scrolls naming descendants of Dagobert II. A noble family in Languedoc was rumored to possess a genealogy tracing their lineage back to a Merovingian princess who escaped the Carolingian purge. Most historians dismissed these claims as romantic fabrications, the product of an age enthralled by mythology. But the secrecy surrounding them only encouraged further speculation. Secret societies found the Merovingian mystery irresistible. They referenced the queens in coded rituals, invoked the sacred bloodline during initiations, and adopted symbols that echoed the dynasty's ancient iconography. A few groups claimed to possess knowledge of a surviving heir, though none ever produced proof. Then came one of the most unexpected developments. Writers, poets, and mystics began connecting the Merovingians to an even older tradition, the legends of the Grail. It started subtly. A poet noted the symbolic similarity between the Merovingians' long hair, believed to carry spiritual power, and the Grail kings of Celtic myth, whose authority came from mystical sources. Another scholar observed that the region associated with Dagobert II overlapped with medieval Grail romances. Before long, theories emerged suggesting that the Grail legends were allegories for a bloodline, not a chalice. The idea spiraled. It whispered that the queens who preserved the Merovingians were the real Grail bearers, safeguarding something far more precious than a relic, a lineage. By the late 19th century, the Merovingian mystery had become a thriving subculture. Esoteric groups in Paris, Vienna, and Rome began conducting research gatherings, where scholars and mystics debated the meaning of Merovingian symbols. Some argued the dynasty had connections to Gnostic sections. Others linked them to forgotten rites hidden within early Christian communities. A few believed the queens were custodians of arcane knowledge passed down from pagan priestesses. And still, the secrecy persisted. Documents disappeared. Manuscripts were altered. Genealogical archives suffered unexplained fires. Museums lost artifacts tied to early Frankish queens. Every loss, accidental or deliberate, only deepened the allure. The Merovingians became the shadow dawn of European history. Ancient, half-visible, endlessly debated. But perhaps the most haunting development was this. Even as secret societies invoked the Merovingians for their own agendas, their greatest mystery remained unsolved. Why had so much energy been spent erasing them? Why had so many scholars, across centuries, faced ruin for investigating them? Why did certain families guard their genealogies so fiercely? And why, even now, did symbols linked to the Merovingian queens appear in places no official historian could explain? By the time the 20th century dawned, the Merovingians had become a paradox, forgotten by history, but unforgettable in legend. Their queens, women who had shaped kingdoms, were now seen as the hidden pillars of a mystery spanning continents and millennia. Their kings, once mocked as do-nothing rulers, were now believed by some to be heirs to a sacred destiny. Their bloodline, thought extinguished, was claimed by dozens of European families, none offering proof, none able to dismiss the possibility. Secret societies, whether real or imagined, had given the Merovingians a second life, not as monarchs, but as symbols of lost truth, suppressed history, and the enduring power of lineage. And through all this, one question grew louder, whispered through libraries, coded into rituals woven into conspiracies. What were the Merovingians hiding, and who was still protecting it? By the late 20th century, when Europe had replaced its kings with parliaments and its crowns with constitutions, the Merovingians should have been nothing more than a footnote in dusty history books. Their bones lay beneath forgotten churches. Their names appeared only in academic journals. Their symbols lingered faintly on old stones. And yet, strangely, inexplicably, the world rediscovered them. What sparked this resurrection was not archaeology or scholarship, but a series of whispers disguised as revelations. Books, films, articles, and fringe theories exploded into public fascination, each one threading the Merovingians deeper into the fabric of modern myth. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know who these ancient kings and queens really were. Suddenly, their bloodline mattered again, not to monarchs, but to millions of curious minds seeking meaning in the unknown. It began with quirky academics, those eccentric researchers who rummaged through obscure archives, who saw patterns where others saw coincidence, who devoured early medieval chronicles like sacred texts. They published quiet essays in alternative journals, suggesting that the Merovingians had been intentionally erased. At first, no one paid them much attention. But ideas, like seeds, need only the right soil. The soil arrived in the form of popular books, works that blurred the line between history and conjecture, claiming that the Merovingians were not just kings but bearers of a sacred bloodline connected to ancient rites, lost sects, even biblical genealogies. Their authors spoke with confidence, weaving documented history with daring speculation. They pointed to the labyrinth of erased records, the cryptic symbols hidden in churches, the inexplicable fear that had silenced scholars for centuries. They argued that such persistent erasure implied something important, something powerful, had been hidden. Readers were captivated. The Merovingians were no longer distant rulers. They were a mystery, a code, a story that felt bigger than history itself. And then came the modern theorists. They pushed further still, connecting the Merovingians to patterns that spanned the ancient world. They argued that the queens, especially, had safeguarded secrets forbidden by the medieval church. They pointed to the legends of the Grail, to lost Gnostic teachings, to symbols that seemed to reappear in places separated by vast distances and centuries. It was irresistible. People longed for these connections because they offered something more alluring than political history, a sense of hidden destiny. Theories multiplied like wildfire. Some claimed the Merovingians descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Others argued they inherited the legacy of ancient priest-kings from the Near East. A few suggested they were the last bearers of a pre-Christian European tradition, one grounded in nature worship, sacred kingship, and matrilineal power. None of these theories had definitive proof, but their allure did not depend on proof. It depended on possibility. Every gap in the historical record became a doorway. Every erased name became a clue. Every vanished manuscript became a symbol of conspiracy. And for the first time in over 1,000 years, the queens Brunhild, Fredegund, Clotilde returned to public consciousness, not as historical figures, but as archetypes. The wise queen, the dark queen, the queen who defies kings. They became icons of feminine power in an age rediscovering female agency. They embodied the idea that women had once shaped destinies from behind the throne, and that history had tried to silence them. Scholarship joined the conversation in unexpected ways. While mainstream academics dismissed most fringe theories, they could not dismiss the fascination. Museums put Merovingian artifacts on display. Documentaries highlighted the dynasty's strange blend of pagan and Christian symbolism. Universities hosted debates about the truth behind the erasures. Suddenly, the Merovingians, a dynasty once reduced to lazy kings, became subjects of serious reevaluation. At the same time, modern mystics adopted the Merovingians as symbols of spiritual truth. Esoteric groups used the dynasty's imagery in rituals meant to reconnect with ancient European traditions. Genealogy enthusiasts scoured databases searching for any hint of descent. Some families proudly resurrected old coats of arms rumored to have Merovingian origins. Others quietly suggested that their lineage carried secrets too precious to publicize. Then the internet arrived. With it came forums, communities, digital archives, all buzzing with speculation. Anonymous users claimed to possess lost genealogies. Others insisted that a Merovingian heir lived in secrecy, protected by guardians whose lineage traced back to the queen's attendants. Some spoke of private archives sealed behind cathedral walls. Others pointed to patterns in medieval art that seemed far too intentional to dismiss. For skeptical historians, this was a nightmare. For everyone else, it was intoxicating. One idea especially captured the public imagination: that the Merovingians never truly disappeared, that their descendants walk among us, unremarkable yet extraordinary. Not kings, but carriers of an ancient thread woven into the fabric of modern society. This idea, half hope, half conspiracy, grew from a deep human longing for continuity, for the belief that our world is shaped not only by wars and politics, but by hidden legacies that survive in blood, memory, and symbol. But beneath all the excitement, something quieter and more profound took place. Ordinary people, reading modern theories and watching sensational documentaries, began to look beyond the claims and ask a deeper question. Why were the Merovingians erased so thoroughly? Why did their destruction resemble a purge rather than a natural decline? Why did the queens, so influential, so powerful, so central, vanish from history almost overnight? The modern fascination revealed something scholars had overlooked: that erasure, this total, is itself evidence. Evidence of a threat. Evidence of a truth someone feared. evidence that the Merovingians, and especially their queens, were not meant to be remembered. And so, the modern world resurrected them. Not as monarchs, not as saints, not as conspiracies, but as questions. Questions that pointed toward a hidden chapter of history. Questions that challenged the official narrative. Questions that refused to fade just as the bloodline, according to legend, refused to die. In the end, the greatest mystery of the Merovingians is not whether their lineage survives. It is why so many across centuries have fought to reveal them, and why just as many have fought to bury them. The truth, whatever it is, sits between those forces, unseen, unresolved, and undeniably alive. Night settles differently over ancient landscapes. It carries a weight, an echo, a faint trembling of the past. In certain places across Europe, lonely forests, abandoned monasteries, forgotten ruins. The air feels almost aware, as if the stones themselves remember. And for those who seek the truth of the Merovingian queens and their sacred bloodline, these places become more than relics. They become thresholds. It is here, in the in-between spaces, that the past stirs. The journey toward understanding the Merovingians does not lead through textbooks or courtly chronicles. It leads through silence, through darkness, through the forgotten corners of Europe where legends have not yet died. As one walks these ancient paths, the lines between history and myth blur like river reflections in the dusk. Footsteps crunch on old leaves. Wind whispers through ruined arches. Birds fall quiet, as though something unseen has begun listening. It often begins with a single moment, a glimpse, a sound, a feeling. A traveler pauses near a centuries-old chapel, whose walls are cracked yet strangely warm to the touch. Another stands before a moss-covered tombstone inscribed with faint symbols. Someone else finds a hidden carving beneath a broken altar, the long-haired figure barely visible in the half-light. These discoveries, small and personal, awaken something deeper, the realization that the Merovingians are not fully gone. Their memory lingers like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Those who seek them feel this. It is not a rational pull but an intuitive one, like a magnet drawing iron. One historian described standing alone in a ruined monastery in the Ardennes when he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of presence, as if someone was standing beside him. Not threatening, he wrote, just watching. He later discovered that the monastery had been built over what was once an early Merovingian burial ground. Another researcher described hearing echoing footsteps behind him while exploring a forgotten chapel dedicated to a queen no chronicle remembered. When he turned, the chapel was empty. Strangest of all are the dreams. Travelers, scholars, even ordinary visitors report them. Repeatedly, across languages and generations, their descriptions are eerily similar. A woman with long hair standing in a stone corridor, or a king with a wounded eye holding a candle that never flickers. Some dream of running through forests, chased by figures who whisper in Old Frankish. Others see a queen placing a strand of hair into a river, watching it glow beneath the water's surface. Such dreams mean nothing to strict historians. But to those who search the hidden stories, they mean everything. Because the Merovingians are not only a timeline. They are a haunting of questions left unanswered, a haunting of a dynasty erased too thoroughly, a haunting of women whose power was buried under centuries of silence. And the deeper one goes into the landscapes they once ruled, the more the veil thins. Walk into the crypt of a forgotten Merovingian chapel and listen long enough, and you might feel the faint vibration of footsteps that ended more than 1,000 years ago. Stand at the site where Dagobert II fell beneath the trees, and you might feel a sudden gust of wind, cold as a blade, though the air is still everywhere else. Climb the worn stone steps of a ruined queen's tower, and you may sense the rustle of long hair brushing against stone, though no one else is there. What is it that lingers? Is it memory? Is it trauma? Is it the residue of a lineage ripped from history with such force that the earth itself recoiled? Or is it something more mystical? Some echo of the sacred kingship that the Merovingians once believed flowed not only through their blood, but through the land itself. Some mystics argue that the dynasty bound itself to Europe's soil through ancient rites blending pagan and Christian elements. They point to legends of kings whose wounds healed when they touched certain rivers, whose dreams foretold disasters, whose queens performed moonlit rituals to bless their children. If such beliefs carried spiritual power, then perhaps the land absorbed them. Perhaps the fall of the Merovingians was not the end of their influence, but the beginning of their transformation, from rulers into echoes, from blood into myth. But the most unsettling feeling shared by those who seek the Merovingians is this. It feels as if the dynasty is watching back. Nearly every researcher who has explored the more esoteric corners of Merovingian history describes the same sensation at some point in their work, the feeling of being guided, as if something, nudges them toward a forgotten document, or a symbol carved into a stone pillar, or a genealogy table tucked between unrelated manuscripts. These discoveries feel too coincidental, too perfectly timed to dismiss as chance. Many describe moments when they felt a presence, comforting, even protective, when they uncovered a truth that had been buried for centuries. Others felt a sudden fear, as though they had crossed a threshold they were not meant to cross. One scholar wrote, "The Merovingians are the only dynasty I have ever researched that feels alive. Not their bodies, but their memory, their story, as if they want it to be found." Perhaps this is imagination. Perhaps it is the psychological effect of immersing oneself in a mystery that resists closure. Or perhaps it is a sign that some stories are not finished. And always, when seekers walk away from these places, from the crypts, the ruins, the stone corridors, they carry something with them. A glimpse, a feeling, a whisper that lingers long after footsteps fade. Because in the end, the Merovingian queens and kings do not return through resurrected documents or perfect relics. They return through sensation, through the chill that creeps across skin in forgotten chapels, through dreams that feel older than memory, through symbols that appear where logic says they shouldn't. Their presence is not physical. It is atmospheric, residual, an echo so powerful it refuses to die. And for those who open themselves to that echo, the past becomes something alive. Not behind them, but around them. Behind every stone. Behind every ruined arch. Behind every unexplained symbol. The feeling grows stronger the deeper one goes. The Merovingians are waiting. Waiting for their story to be understood. Waiting for their truth to be spoken. Waiting, perhaps, for the moment when the world is finally ready to hear what was hidden. At this point in the journey, the story of the Merovingians stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a revelation. One that arrives not with thunder, but with a slow, startling clarity. The deeper you travel into their erased world, the more every detail begins to make sense. The missing manuscripts, the silent queens, the destroyed genealogies, the suppressed scholarship, the stone symbols carved in places no king bothered to visit. Each piece forms a pattern that can no longer be ignored. The truth is simple but unsettling. The Merovingians were not erased because they were forgotten. They were erased because someone wanted them forgotten. And the closer you get to that realization, the more the entire story sharpens. The queens, those fierce, brilliant, politically strategic women, were not mere footnotes. They were the architects of continuity. They preserved alliances, guarded heirs, passed down traditions that predated Christianity, and carried a kind of power that frightened the systems rising around them. They were guardians of identity, memory, and legitimacy, forces the Carolingians could not control. To erase the dynasty, the queens had to vanish first. Even now, when you step back and look at the broader arc of medieval Europe, the pattern stands out like a scar. Every place the queens once stood is precisely where the evidence grows thin. Their letters disappear. Their portraits fade. Their decisions go unrecorded. Their alliances are rewritten as accidents or sins. Their deaths are described without ceremony. Their lives shrink to shadows on the margins. But shadows only appear where there is light. And the closer you get to the truth of these women, their influence, their intelligence, their unbreakable will, the more you understand why later rulers feared them. These queens were not simply royal figures. They were the custodians of something older than the Frankish kingdom, older than the church that tried to reshape Europe, older than the dynasties that followed. They carried a legacy of sacred kingship, woven from myth and blood, a legacy that connected royalty to spirituality, ancestry to legitimacy, and women to power in ways later rulers could never allow. This is the secret history tries to bury. That early medieval Europe was shaped not just by men who wielded swords, but by women who wielded memory. The queens preserved ideas that the new order wanted erased, ideas about spiritual authority, divine lineage, the blending of pagan and Christian identity, and the possibility that some royal bloodlines were more than political constructions. To destroy these ideas, the queens needed to be destroyed too, not by death but by silence. And that silence became the greatest clue of all. For in that silence, the queens became immortal. They became the unanswered question that refuses to fade. They became the presence that lingers in ruined monasteries and forgotten chapels. They became the reason scholars kept searching even after being warned away. They became the reason modern theorists felt compelled to resurrect their stories, connecting threads that official history tried to cut. And here, in the quiet heart of the mystery, the final revelation emerges. The Merovingians were not meant to return as rulers. They were meant to return as a truth, one capable of reshaping how we understand power, memory, and history itself. Their bloodline may or may not survive, but their legacy does, because it lives in every gap, every symbol, every erased page that invites a question instead of providing an answer. The queens left behind a message carved into the very absences surrounding them. What is forgotten can still endure, and what is hidden can still be found. Their story survives because it was never just a story. It was a warning, a reminder, a whisper that outlived the kings who feared it. And now, standing at the edge of this revelation, one thing becomes clear. History buried the Merovingian queens, but the truth kept rising. At the edge of the Merovingian mystery, when all the clues have been gathered and all the shadows traced, a final realization emerges. Quiet, unmistakable, and far more profound than any hidden genealogy or secret heir. The truth is that the real power of this dynasty was never locked in blood alone. It lived in memory. It lived in the queens who refused to let their world collapse without leaving something behind. And it lives now in the questions that rise whenever someone looks back into the silence they left behind. The more one studies the erased chronicles, the vanished manuscripts, the carved symbols hidden in forgotten chapels, the more the pattern becomes clear. The Merovingian queens were not removed because they were irrelevant. They were removed because they carried a power that frightened those who came after. A power rooted in continuity, in myth, in a conception of sovereignty that could not be replaced by swords or decrees. To erase the queens was to rewrite the world. But erasure has a strange weakness. It requires forgetting. And the Merovingians refused to be forgotten. Their story survives in broken fragments, half-legends whispered by villagers, patterns etched into stone, memories preserved by those who felt the truth deserved more than silence. Their legacy hums beneath the surface of Europe like a pulse waiting to be noticed. And when we finally see it, we understand the real revelation. The Merovingian dynasty did not disappear. Transformed. It became a mirror reflecting the deep human instinct to protect what is sacred, to question what is missing, to reclaim what was taken. In the end, the queens leave us not with certainty, but with something far more powerful. A reminder that history's greatest truths are often the ones it worked hardest to hide. In the end, the story of the Merovingian queens does not close like a door. It lingers, suspended in the air like dust motes caught in a beam of light, shimmering between truth and legend. We walk away not with answers but with questions, questions that feel older than the ruins, older than the manuscripts, older than the dynasty itself. What does it mean that a lineage can be erased from chronicles yet remain alive in symbols? What does it mean that queens, silenced in their own time, now speak louder than the kings who replaced them? What does it mean that a story buried for 12 centuries refuses to stay buried? As the camera fades from forest paths, from stone corridors, from lonely chapels where echoes linger, we feel the presence of something unresolved, something waiting. History may have tried to cut the Merovingians from its pages, but history cannot cut memory, cannot cut myth. It cannot cut the quiet, stubborn truth that some legacies endure because they are meant to. In the soft hush of the closing moments, We sense the queen standing just a breath away, Brunhild with her iron resolve, Fredegund with her sharp gaze, Clotilde with her unshakable faith, and the unnamed women who fought in silence. They are no longer shadows. They are witnesses. And as we step back into the world of certainty and modern noise, one thought follows like a whisper slipping between the leaves. Perhaps the real secret of the Merovingian bloodline was never about who survived, but about what survives in us. The courage to question, the instinct to seek, the refusal to let truth be buried. Some stories end. This one endures.